The Hurricane in a Pipe, A Narrative of the Pneumatic Post, by Mark Twain. Copyright 2026. James Henderson. Chapter 1. The Velocity of Modern Boredom. I have always noticed that the more a man has to say, the longer he is willing to wait for the post, whereas a man with nothing in his head but the price of lard or a bit of stale gossip is generally in such a tearing hurry to deliver it that he would harness a lightning bolt if he could find a way to keep from being fried in the process. It is a peculiar feature of our enlightened age that we have spent centuries perfecting the art of the hurry, only to find, upon arriving at our destination, that we haven't the slightest notion of what to do with ourselves once we get there. The horse, in his day, was considered a marvel of expedition. If you wished to tell a man 3 counties away that your cow had birthed a 2-headed calf, you entrusted the news to a creature of 4 legs and a certain amount of horse sense. The horse would trot along at a dignified pace, stopping occasionally to contemplate a blade of grass or a particularly interesting puddle, giving you ample time to realize that the news of the calf wasn't worth the paper it was written on. By the time the message arrived, the calf had likely died, the recipient had forgotten who you were, and the world had continued to spin in its orbit without any perceptible hitch. There was a certain mercy in that delay. It allowed for the evaporation of human folly. But man, in his infinite restlessness, grew dissatisfied with the horse. He looked at the wind and the steam and the vacuum, and he felt a sudden itching desperation to send his nonsense to his neighbor 10 seconds faster than any beast could manage. Thus, we have arrived at the era of the pneumatic post, the great subterranean hurricane in a pipe. It is a grand and expensive business, this rushing of the unremarkable. We have bored holes through the very bedrock of our cities, laid miles of iron gut, and installed massive wheezing engines for the sole purpose of sucking a brass canister from one end of town to the other. And what is inside this vessel of high-speed destiny? A bill for a hat that wasn't worth the felt it was blocked from. A dinner invitation to a house where the food is bad and the conversation is worse. Or perhaps a brief note from a nephew asking for a loan he has no intention of repaying. I stood in a post office recently, a cathedral of modern efficiency, and watched the brass canisters arrive. There is a sudden thump, a sound like a giant swallowing a marble, and out pops a little cylinder, breathless and hot, from its journey through the dark. The clerk opens it with the gravity of a man unsealing a treaty that might end a war. He pulls out a slip of paper, glances at it, and I see that it is a request for a pound of sausage to be delivered to a lady on the 4th ward. Now, consider the machinery involved in that sausage request. There are the steam boilers, the massive air pumps, the miles of subterranean tubing, the engineers, the stokers, the grease monkeys, and the clerks, all of them straining their muscles and their intellects so that Mrs. Higgins does not have to wait an extra 20 minutes for her breakfast. We have built a mechanical marvel to conquer time and space, and we use it to transport the trivialities of the kitchen. There is a certain vanity in speed. We believe that if we can move a thought at 30 miles an hour beneath the cobblestones, the thought itself must be 30 times more valuable than the one that plods along on a pony. We have confused the velocity of the delivery with the weight of the message. A lie can travel halfway around the world in a tube, while the truth is still looking for its boots. But when the truth finally arrives, It doesn't matter if it came by pneumatic suction or on the back of a crippled turtle, it is still the truth. I once knew a man in Missouri who was so obsessed with saving time that he invented a machine to pull his boots on for him. It was a magnificent contraption of pulleys and levers. It saved him exactly 4 seconds every morning. He spent those 4 seconds sitting on the edge of his bed, staring at the wall and wondering what to do with the time he had saved. Eventually, the machine malfunctioned and threw him out the window, which saved him the time of walking down the stairs, but cost him a considerable amount in doctor's bills. The pneumatic post is much like that boot machine. It is a monument to our impatience. We are terrified of the silence that exists between the sending of a message and the receiving of an answer. We used to fill that silence with reflection or perhaps a nap, both of which are highly beneficial to the soul. Now we fill it with the frantic sound of air being pumped through a pipe. We have created a world where it is possible to be bored at a much higher velocity than our ancestors ever dreamed. In the old days, if you were angry with a man, you sat down and wrote him a scorching letter. By the time you had found a stamp, walked to the post office, and waited for the mail coach, your blood had cooled. You might even decide to tear the letter up and buy the man a drink instead. But with the pneumatic tube, your fury is sucked through the earth and delivered to his doorstep while your face is still red. There is no time for the intervention of common sense. We are delivering our impulses before we have even finished feeling them. It is a strange thing to think of the city as a giant flute, with the wind of commerce blowing through its iron veins. Beneath the feet of the bankers and the beggars, the canisters are flying, small brass souls hurrying to their judgment. They carry the secrets of the bourse, the whispers of lovers, and the mundane demands of the butcher, and all of it is moved by the great vacuum. I find a certain poetic justice in that. The vacuum, a space containing nothing, is the very thing that moves the modern world. It is the perfect representation of the official mind. If you take a high-ranking politician and subject his brain to a pressure gauge, you will find a vacuum so pure and so absolute that it would make a pneumatic engineer weep with envy. It is this emptiness, this lack of resistance, that allows for such rapid movement. As we embark on this narrative of the pressurized post, let us keep in mind that speed is not wisdom. A man may travel at the rate of a cannonball and still be an ass when he hits the target. In fact, the velocity likely only serves to make his asinine nature more impactful upon arrival. We shall see how the world was honeycombed with these iron pipes, how the great cities of London, Paris, and New York attempted to breathe their thoughts through the mud, and how, in the end, we found that no matter how fast we send the mail, we can never quite outrun ourselves. For even in a brass canister traveling at 30 miles an hour, a man's boredom and his folly are always there, tucked inside with the postage, waiting to be let out at the other end. Chapter 2. The Gospel According to the Air Pump. The engine room of a pneumatic station is a place of profound theological instruction, provided you can hear yourself think above the unholy shrieking of the valves. To the casual observer, it is merely a basement full of grease and heat. But to the man of a contemplative turn of mind, it is the cathedral of a new religion. Here, the great steam-belching deities of the 19th century reside, and their gospel is one of relentless, thumping pressure. I have always harbored a deep respect for a steam engine, It is the only thing on earth that can be simultaneously magnificent and entirely idiotic. It spends its whole life straining its iron sinews to turn a wheel that leads to another wheel, which eventually leads to a piston that spends its afternoon trying to push a hole through the atmosphere. In the case of the pneumatic post, we have harnessed this titanic power for a truly remarkable purpose, the manufacturing of nothing. You see, to move a canister through a pipe, you must first convince the air to get out of the way, or else bribe the vacuum to pull from the other end. This requires an air pump of such prodigious proportions that it looks like a giant's leg trying to kick its way out of a dungeon. It is a massive, rhythmic, and sweaty business. It takes 10 tons of coal, 40 gallons of lubricating oil, and the sanity of 3 engineers just to create half an ounce of nothing at the far end of a tube in Brooklyn. There is a certain irony in this that I find deeply satisfying. In my youth, if you wanted to find a vacuum, you simply looked into the eyes of a village constable or listened to a politician's promise. Vacuums were a natural resource, abundant and free for the taking. But science has stepped in and decided that the only vacuum worth having is one that costs $4,000 an hour to maintain. We have reached a point in our civilization where we must build a 3-story engine to achieve a state of emptiness that a man could get for nothing just by falling asleep in a church pew. I visited one of these shrines of suction not long ago. The head engineer was a man named McSweeney, a man who had spent so much time around steam that he seemed to be composed largely of condensed water and soot. He moved among the machinery with the quiet reverence of a high priest. He didn't speak to his engines. He whispered to them, coaxing them not to explode, much as one might speak to a temperamental mule or a rich ant with a weak heart. "She's a delicate darling," McSweeney told me, patting a cylinder that was vibrating with enough force to rattle the teeth out of a horse 3 blocks away. "Delicate?" I asked. "She looks like she's trying to swallow the building." "Aye," he said, with a twinkle of madness in his eye, "but she's temperamental. If you don't feed her the right coal, or if the pressure in the 4th Street line drops by a whisker, she'll take a notion to stop sucking and start blowing. And when a pneumatic engine decides to blow instead of suck, you've got a catastrophe on your hands that'll deliver a 3-cent letter with the force of a naval bombardment." This, I realized, was the gospel according to the air pump. Success is entirely dependent upon the direction of your intentions. If the pump is in a good mood, the city's gossip flows like wine. If it is in a fit of pique, it will hold its breath until the entire commerce of the district turns blue in the face. The air pump is a jealous god. It demands constant sacrifice. It eats coal by the wagon load and drinks oil by the barrel. It requires a priesthood of men who don't mind losing their hearing by the age of 30 and who are willing to spend their lives in a subterranean twilight, illuminated only by the flicker of a gauge and the glow of a furnace. And for what? So that a lawyer on Wall Street can receive a summons 10 minutes before he has a chance to flee the country. There is a grandeur in it, I suppose. There is something noble about the way the great iron flywheel spins, a blur of polished steel that represents the very heartbeat of modern progress. It is a beautiful sight, provided you don't think too hard about the fact that all this motion, all this heat, and all this noise is dedicated to moving a little brass pill filled with laundry receipts. I watched McSweeney adjust a valve. A hiss of steam escaped, a sound like 1,000 angry geese. "That's the breath of the city, that is," he shouted over the din. "Every time that piston strokes, 1,000 words are flying under the cobblestones. There's love letters, there's death threats, there's grocery list, and there's the secrets of the treasury, all of it moving on the wind we make right here." It occurred to me then that the air pump is the most honest thing in the city. It doesn't care what is in the canisters. It doesn't distinguish between a poem and a bill. It treats the sublime and the ridiculous with the same impartial suction. It is a great mechanical equalizer. It proves that in the eyes of the vacuum, all human communication is of exactly the same weight, which is to say, it weighs nothing at all until someone at the other end decides to read it. We have built these massive engines to facilitate the flow of information, as the newspapers like to call it. But information, like water, doesn't always improve by being moved faster. If you take a cup of stagnant pond water and pump it through a pipe at 60 miles an hour, it doesn't come out the other end as champagne. It just comes out as stagnant pond water that is slightly more agitated. Yet we worship at the altar of the pump. We marvel at the pressure gauges. We stand in awe of the boilers. We have replaced the quiet, thoughtful world of the quill and a pony with the screeching, oily world of the piston and the valve. We have traded the peace of the soul for the pressure of the pipe. As I left McSweeney and his temple of steam, I looked back at the great flywheel. It was still spinning, relentless and indifferent, turning the coal of the earth into the breath of the post. It was a magnificent achievement of the human mind, a testament to our ability to build a machine for any purpose, no matter how absurd. I walked out into the sunlight of the street and listened. I couldn't hear the engines anymore, but I knew they were there, down in the dark, straining and heaving. Somewhere beneath my boots, a canister was whistling through the iron dark, carrying a message of vital unimportance to a man who was likely too busy to read it. The gospel, according to the air pump, is a simple one. Move it fast, move it loud, and never mind where it's going. It is a philosophy that has served the steam engine well, and it is one that the rest of humanity seems determined to adopt as its own. We are a race of creatures who have learned how to manufacture a hurricane in a bottle, and we are so proud of the bottle that we have entirely forgotten to wonder why we wanted the hurricane in the first place. Chapter 3. A Subterranean Hurricane. If a piece of parchment had any sense of pride, which thank heaven it does not, or we should have a revolution in every stationery shop in the country, it would surely object to being stuffed into a brass canister like a criminal being bundled into a paddy wagon. There is a profound lack of dignity in the process. One moment you are a refined letter, perhaps scented with lavender or bearing the legal weight of a last will and testament. The next, you are being shoved into a metal capsule, your edges curled, your seal squeezed, and your very identity reduced to a cargo that must fit a 4-inch diameter. Once the lid is screwed tight, the world vanishes. This is the first lesson of the pneumatic life. The dark is absolute. It is a darkness so thick you could cut it with a knife and sell it for coal. And then there is the weight. You sit there in the loading breech, feeling the faint tremors of the city above, the heavy tread of an omnibus, the clatter of a drayman's cart, and you imagine you have a moment to collect your thoughts. You are mistaken. there is a sudden, sickening sound, a thwack sub-hiss, which is the sound of the universe deciding it no longer wants you in your current location. The trapdoor opens, the vacuum catches hold of your brass heels, and suddenly you are not merely traveling. You are being hurried toward judgment at a speed that would make a comet feel sluggish. Traveling through a pneumatic tube at 30 miles an hour is an experience that I suspect is very similar to being a soul in the hands of an angry but efficient angel. There is no scenery to admire. There are no stations where a man might buy a sandwich or a newspaper. There is only the roar of the air, a subterranean hurricane that has been captured and forced to work for the Postmaster General, and the rhythmic clack, clack, clack of the canister hitting the joints of the iron pipe. I have often wondered what a letter thinks during those 3 minutes of transit. If it is a love letter, does the heat of its passion help the vacuum along? If it is a bill, does it feel a certain malicious joy in the knowledge that it is rushing toward a man who cannot afford to pay it? I suspect, however, that the sensation is mostly one of profound confusion. To be a stationary object 1 second and a projectile the next is enough to unsettle the most stoic of documents. There is a peculiar geography to the underground. Up on the surface, a man knows where he is by the landmarks. The church spire, the saloon, the statue of a general who lost a battle but won a monument. But in the tube, your landmarks are entirely auditory. A hollow, echoing boom means you are passing under the river, with 40 feet of mud and 1,000,000 gallons of water pressing down on your iron sleeve. A sharp, high-pitched whistle indicates a curve in the line, where the canister leans into the turn with a shriek of brass against iron that sounds like a banshee with a stubbed toe. A dull, rhythmic thumping suggests you're passing beneath a busy intersection, where the heavy pulse of the city's commerce vibrates through the earth and into your very marrow. It is a lonely way to travel. In a railway carriage, you have the company of your fellow man, which is to say you have the opportunity to be annoyed by his snoring or his opinions on the silver standard. But in the canister, you are alone with your message. You are a secret in a bottle, tossed not into the sea, but into the bowels of the earth. There is a certain terror in the efficiency of it. We have spent thousands of years learning how to move across the surface of the planet, but we have only just begun to learn how to move through it. When a man is on a horse, he is in control, or at least the horse is. When a man is on a train, there is a driver and a stoker. But when a message is in a pneumatic tube, it is at the mercy of the invisible. It is being pulled by a force it cannot see toward a destination it cannot influence. It is the most modern sensation I can imagine, the feeling of being perfectly helpless while moving at a terrifying velocity. I once asked a tube boy if he ever worried about a canister getting lost in the dark. He looked at me with the pity that the young always reserve for the ancient and the uninformed. "Lost?" he said, wiping a smudge of grease from his nose. "Mister, there ain't nowhere for it to go. It's in a pipe. It either goes to the end or it stays where it is. It ain't like a human being. It can't decide to hop off at the wrong stop to get a drink. There is much wisdom in that. The pneumatic tube is a world without choices. It is a straight line through a crooked world. And yet, I cannot help but feel that something is lost in the rushing. When you send a message by a messenger, there is a human element. The boy might stop to watch a dog fight, or he might get distracted by a pretty face. But at least he is alive. He is part of the great comedy. But the canister is a piece of the great machinery. It represents our desire to remove the human element from our affairs entirely. We want our news to arrive with the cold, unblinking speed of a falling rock. We have created a subterranean hurricane because we are too impatient to wait for the wind. As the canister approaches its destination, the character of the journey changes. The roar of the vacuum begins to die away, replaced by a cushion of air, the air brake of the underground. You feel yourself slowing down, the violence of the hurricane softening into a gentle but firm insistence. And then the final act, the arrival. There is a sudden pop, like a giant champagne cork, and the canister is spat out into a wire basket. It sits there for a moment, clicking and cooling, looking for all the world as if it hasn't just spent the last 3 minutes being screamed through the center of the earth. The clerk reaches down, unscrews the cap, and pulls out the message. The letter is a bit more wrinkled than it was, and it smells faintly of hot iron and stale wind, but it has arrived. It has survived the hurricane. It has been hurried to its judgment, and now it must face the most terrifying thing of all, the person who is about to read it. We marvel at the speed, we brag about the pressure, and we celebrate the machinery. But I wonder if the letter, given the choice, wouldn't have preferred the horse. At least on the back of a horse, you can see the sun, and if you're lucky, you might even get a glimpse of the two-headed calf before it expires. In the tube, all you get is the dark and the hurry. And as any man over the age of 50 can tell you, the world is already in quite enough of a hurry without us building a pipe to help it along. Chapter 4. The Dignity of the Brass Canister. If you were to encounter a pneumatic canister resting upon a velvet cushion in a museum, you might mistake it for a particularly stout telescope, or perhaps a very expensive jar of pomade intended for a duke's whiskers. It is a handsome object in a functional, no-nonsense sort of way, a gleaming cylinder of brass, capped at both ends and girded with rings of thick industrial felt that look for all the world like the stiff collars worn by particularly upright Victorian deacons. But a canister's life is not one of repose upon velvet cushions. Its destiny is a far more violent affair. It is, so far as I can determine, the only object in the history of human endeavor designed to be both perfectly airtight and subjected to the daily, repetitive indignity of being sucked through a straw. There is a singular kind of stoicism required of a piece of brass in such a position. A steam engine, for all its noise, is at least allowed to stay in one place and be admired for its power. A locomotive is permitted to roar across the countryside with a certain majestic arrogance, frightening cows and impressive the locals. But the canister is a humble projectile. It is the message boy of the abyss. It spends its entire existence being kicked from one end of a dark hole to the other, only to be grabbed by a grease-stained clerk, emptied of its contents, and immediately kicked back the other way. I have spent some time observing these vessels, and I have come to the conclusion that a canister possesses more character than many of the people who use it. When it is new, it is a glorious thing, bright, shiny, and full of ambition. It reflects the gaslight of the post office with a cheery, golden optimism. It seems to say, I am ready to carry the secrets of the empire. I am prepared to transport the very pulses of trade. But give it a week in the tubes, and that optimism begins to show the scars of experience. The brass becomes dull and dented from its 1,000-mile journeys through the iron dark. The felt rings, those proud collars, become frayed and blackened by the soot of the pumps and the friction of the pipes. It develops a weary, cynical look, like a man who has spent 20 years working in the customs house and has finally realized that most of his fellow citizens are trying to cheat him. The construction of the thing is a marvel of Victorian desperation. It must be light enough to be moved by a breath, yet strong enough to withstand being slammed against a cast-iron bulkhead at 30 miles an hour. It must be sealed tight enough to keep out the damp of the London fog or the grime of a New York gutter, yet it must be capable of being opened in a second by a boy whose thumbs are slick with ham sandwich grease. The felt rings are the most vital part of its anatomy. They act as the piston that catches the wind. Without those rings, the canister would sit in the tube as useless as a politician in a crisis. Plenty of noise around it, but no movement. These rings must fit the pipe with the precision of a glove on a lady's hand. If they are too loose, the air whistles past and the canister lingers in the dark, a forgotten island in a sea of suction. If they are too tight, the canister wedges itself in a curve, and you have a subterranean catastrophe that requires the mobilization of a small army of engineers. I find a deep philosophical comedy in the straw aspect of the business. We think of ourselves as a dignified species. We build cathedrals, we write epic poetry, and we debate the finer points of international law. And yet, the very pinnacle of our communication system is based on the same principle used by a toddler with a glass of lemonade. The entire city of New York is, in effect, a giant soda fountain. Beneath the streets, the great vacuum is constantly trying to take a long, deep sip of the brass canisters. We have turned the earth into a hollow reed, and we spend our days blowing and sucking our thoughts through it. There is a certain lack of grandeur in being part of a beverage, even if you are the most important dispatch in the state. Imagine, if you will, a high-stakes legal document, a paper that determines the fate of a railroad or the ownership of a coal mine. That document is treated with the utmost reverence in the courtroom. It is handled with clean hands. It is debated by men in expensive robes. But the moment it is destined for the pneumatic post, all that dignity evaporates. It is rolled up into a tight, uncomfortable tube, stuffed into the brass belly of the canister, and then, whoosh, it is inhaled by the earth. For those few minutes of transit, that multi-million-dollar document is nothing more than a bit of grit in the throat of the city. It is being moved by the same forces that pull dust into a vacuum cleaner. It is a sobering thought. It suggests that our most important affairs are, in the eyes of the physical universe, merely objects to be moved from point A to point B, with the greatest possible efficiency and the least possible ceremony. I once saw a canister that had been through a mishap. It had been stuck in a damp section of the pipe for 3 days during a particularly wet spring in Paris. When it was finally retrieved, it looked like a soldier returning from a very long and very unsuccessful campaign. It was covered in a layer of subterranean slime. Its brass was tarnished to the color of a bad penny, and one of its felt rings was hanging off like a tattered bandage. The clerk opened it, and out tumbled a damp, bedraggled note. I expected it to be a matter of life and death, given the effort required to rescue it. I leaned in to see. It was a request from a gentleman to his tailor, complaining that his trousers were too tight in the seat. 3 days of engineering labor, a mile of blocked commerce, and the dignity of a brass vessel sacrificed, all to deliver a complaint about a pair of pants. The canister didn't complain, of course. It simply sat there on the counter, dripping onto the floor, waiting to be wiped down, refelted, and shoved back into the darkness. It had no opinion on the trousers. It had no interest in the tailor. It was a professional. It knew that its job was not to judge the message, but merely to survive the journey. There is a lesson there for the rest of us, I suppose. We spend so much of our lives worrying about the content of our days, the drama, the importance, the weight of our responsibilities. We would do well to emulate the dignity of the brass canister. It doesn't matter if you are carrying a king's ransom or a laundry list. Your job is to keep your seal tight, hold your breath, and try not to get stuck in the curves. And if the world treats you like a pea in a blowgun, don't take it personally. Just make sure your felt rings are in good order and try to make a satisfying thump when you reach the other end. After all, in a world that is mostly made of vacuum, the only thing a man or a canister can truly count on is his own ability to withstand the pressure without losing his lid. Chapter 5. The Tube Boy's Lungs and Legacies. If you wish to see the true master of the Subterranean Hurricane, you must look past the chief engineer with his gold-rimmed spectacles and his complicated charts of atmospheric pressure. You must look past the postmaster general who sits in a mahogany office and imagines he is the one directing the flow of the world's wisdom. To find the real power, you must descend into the damp twilight of the transfer station and find a boy of 14, with a face like a soot-stained walnut and a mind that is currently 3,000 miles away, probably engaged in a mental fishing trip on the Mississippi. This is the Tube Boy, the lowliest, grimiest, and most vital cog in the great pneumatic works. He is the guardian of the lever, and it has been my observation that a boy with a lever is a more dangerous thing than a king with a scepter, and considerably more unpredictable. A king, you see, is hampered by tradition, by advisers, and by a nagging concern for his own head. But a 14-year-old boy in a basement, charged with the task of opening and closing valves for 10 hours a day, is hampered by nothing but his own boredom. And boredom, in the hands of a youth, is a creative force that would put a Greek tragedy to shame. The Tube Boy sits upon a 3-legged stool that has seen better centuries, positioned between 2 iron muzzles that look like the cannons of a man-o'-war. His world is a constant cycle of clack, hiss, pop. He receives a canister, checks the label, shoves it into the next pipe, pulls the lever to unleash the vacuum, and then waits for the next one. It is a labor that requires the precision of a watchmaker and the patience of a saint. Naturally, it is given to a creature who possesses neither. I watched one of these young potentates recently. His name was Toby, or at least that is what he answered to when a clerk threw a wet sponge at him to wake him up. Toby was a masterpiece of industrial camouflage. He was so thoroughly coated in coal dust and lubricating oil that if he stood still against the machinery, he would vanish entirely, leaving only 2 bright, mischievous eyes floating in the gloom. In his left hand, Toby held a half-eaten ham sandwich, a sturdy, resilient object that appeared to have been manufactured from the same material as the felt rings on the canisters. In his right hand, He held the lever that controlled the pressure for the entire Midtown line. It was a sobering sight. I realized that the entire commerce of the city, the fortunes of the brokers, the legal maneuvers of the judges, the very heartbeats of the town, was resting entirely upon Toby's ability to remember which way to pull that handle while simultaneously negotiating a difficult bite of ham. "Is it difficult work?" I asked him during a brief lull in the atmospheric screaming. Toby swallowed a piece of bread that was clearly not intended for human consumption and looked at me with a weary, ancient wisdom. "It ain't the work, mister," he said. "It's the waitin'. The air wants to move, and the pipe wants to hold it, and I'm the one stuck in the middle keeping them from having a row. It's like being the nursemaid to a giant that only knows how to scream and spit." He then demonstrated the dangerous aspect of his office. A canister arrived with a particularly violent thump. Toby didn't even look at it. He was watching a spider crawl down a nearby pipe. He waited until the spider reached a specific rust spot, a moment of exquisite tension, and then he slammed the lever home. There was a sound like a thunderclap. The canister didn't just move, it vanished. It departed with such velocity that I suspect the recipient at the other end didn't so much receive the mail as they were assaulted by it. "You shouldn't have done that," I remarked. "That looked like enough pressure to send that canister straight through the bedrock and out the other side into China." "Maybe," Toby said, with a shrug of his thin shoulders. "But it gave the spider a bit of a start, didn't it?" This is the legacy of the Tube Boy. He is the lungs of the city, but he is also its primary source of chaos. When the pressure in the lines fluctuates wildly, when a letter arrives looking like it was fired from a mortar, or when a message lingers in the dark for an hour, because the operator was busy practicing his aim with a pea shooter, it is because the human element has asserted itself over the mechanical. We build these magnificent systems to be perfect, but we forget that we must always staff them with boys. And a boy is a creature who cannot behold a perfectly functioning system without wanting to see what happens if you pull the wrong handle just once, for the sake of the experiment. There is a peculiar hierarchy among these lads. A boy who works the main artery, the great pipes that connect the central offices, is a different breed from the boy who manages the small veins that lead to the residential districts. The main artery boys are the aristocrats of the basement. They handle the canisters of the wealthy and the powerful with a disdain that is truly regal. They know that they are the ones who allow the millionaires to keep their millions. If they were to hold their breath for 10 minutes, the stock market would likely faint dead away. But what of their legacies? What becomes of a boy who spends his formative years in a vacuum? I suspect they become the men who truly understand how the world works. A boy who has managed the pressure of a city's secrets knows that everything in life, politics, religion, and marriage, is ultimately a matter of managing the suction. If you have enough vacuum at one end and enough hot air at the other, you can move anything. They grow up to be men who are never surprised by anything. They have seen the unauthorized cargoes, the dead rats, the stolen watches, and the occasional live kitten that find their way into the tubes. They have heard the pipes talk in the dark. They know that beneath the dignified surface of the city, there is a frantic, messy, and loud reality that is held together by nothing more than a few iron valves, and a bored youth who wants to go home. As I left Toby to his ham and his livers, I felt a strange sense of security. The world likes to think it is run by the men in the high hats and the long coats. But it is a comfort to know that in reality it is run by Toby. For while the men in the high hats are busy worrying about the future of progress, Toby is only worried about the spider and the ham sandwich. He has no grand illusions. He knows that his job is to keep the air moving, and as long as he does that, the world will keep spinning. He is the master of the Subterranean Hurricane, and he is perfectly aware that a scepter is a fine thing for a king to hold in a portrait. But if you actually want to get something done, if you want to move the world 5 minutes faster than it wants to go, you'd best put your money on the boy with the lever and the soot-stained face. Just be prepared for the fact that he might decide to send your message by way of China, if the spider happens to be moving particularly slow that afternoon. Chapter 6. Paris and the Art of the Pressurized Secret. If you wish to see a machine used for its intended purpose, which is to say, to facilitate the rapid distribution of things that are none of your business, you must go to Paris. In America, we use the pneumatic tube to move the price of pork. In England, they use it to move the dampness from one basement to another. But in Paris, they have turned the system into a national art form. They have realized that while a man can wait 3 days for a loaf of bread, he cannot wait 3 minutes to tell a lie about his neighbor's wife. The French call their system the nous, a word that sounds like a man trying to sneeze while being polite about it. It is a fitting name. There is a certain airy, effortless quality to the way a Frenchman conducts a scandal. In New York, a secret is a heavy, cumbersome thing that requires a lawyer and a notarized statement. In Paris, a secret is a gas, and the pneumatic tube is the only vessel capable of containing its effervescence. I have often remarked that the French are a people who would rather be interesting than be right. They have a natural talent for the dramatic, a trait that extends even to their mail. When you enter a Parisian post office to send a petit bleu, the little blue slips of paper that are the lifeblood of the city, you do not feel like a man conducting a transaction. You feel like a conspirator in a grand opera. The clerk does not merely take your message. He examines it with the eye of a jeweler. He folds it with a flourish that would make a silk weaver weep with envy. He places it into the canister as if he were laying a saint's knuckle into a reliquary. And when he shoves it into the tube, he doesn't just pull a lever. He performs a gesture of such finality and speed that one cannot help but think of the guillotine. Indeed, the Parisian pneumatic system is the guillotine of social reputations. It is swift, it is silent, and once the blade has fallen or the canister has been sucked into the dark, there is no calling it back. A rumor launched at the Place de la Concorde at 10 in the morning will have successfully decapitated a dozen reputations by lunch and have them buried and forgotten by the time the evening wine is poured. I stood in a station near the Rue de Rivoli and watched the arrival of the afternoon breath. In Paris, the operators do not resemble our New York Tobies, who are primarily composed of coal dust and apathy. The French operator is a man of style. He wears a cap that suggests military rank, and he handles the pressure gauges as if he were conducting a symphony. He explained to me, in a language that requires more muscles in the face than I care to exercise, that the Parisian system was designed for the psychology of the moment. "Monsieur," he said with a shrug that involved his entire soul, "an American, he wants to know the price of steel. This is a cold thing. It can wait. But a Frenchman, he wants to know if he is still loved, or if the minister has been insulted, or if the chef at the cafe has finally lost his mind and put garlic in the souffle. These are hot things. They must fly." I reckon he had a point. There is a certain cruelty in making a man wait for his anxiety. If you're going to be ruined, it is much better to have it over with at 30 miles an hour than to have it linger in the pocket of a slow-moving postman. The French have honeycombed their city with these tubes with a thoroughness that suggests they are more interested in what is happening beneath the cobblestones than what is happening above them. They have connected every ministry, every bank, and nearly every cafe of any standing. It is a subterranean nervous system, twitching with the impulses of a city that never sleeps and rarely stops talking. I observed that the Petit Bleu is often used for the appointment. Now, in Missouri, if you want to meet a man for a drink, you shout across the street at him. In London, you send him a formal card 3 weeks in advance. In Paris, you send a pneumatic message that arrives while the ink is still wet, informing him that you will be at the corner table in exactly 12 minutes, and that if he is not there, you will assume he has joined a monastery or died of boredom. The speed of the system creates a peculiar kind of civic vertigo. Because everyone knows that a message can arrive in 10 minutes, everyone lives in a state of perpetual expectation. You cannot sit in a park and watch the clouds without the nagging fear that a brass canister is currently whistling through the mud beneath your bench, carrying a message that changes your plans, your fortunes, or your marital status. There is an art, too, in the pressurized secret. The French have discovered that the medium affects the message. A letter that is delivered by a horse is a leisurely, descriptive affair. It has time for metaphors and reflections on the weather. But a letter that is sucked through a pipe must be lean. It must be sharp. It must have the velocity of wit. The Parisian pneumatic note is a masterpiece of brevity. It is the telegram's more sophisticated cousin. It doesn't have the stuttering, mechanical rhythm of the Morse code. It has the breathless urgency of a whispered confidence. It is the first instant communication of the modern world, and the French have used it to ensure that their gossip is always fresher than their bread. I asked the operator if the system ever failed. He looked horrified, as if I had asked him if the sun ever forgot to rise. "Monsieur, the Neu is the heart of Paris. If the tubes stop, the city stops. The lovers would not know where to meet. The politicians would not know who to betray. The journalists would have nothing to print. We would be reduced to talking to one another like peasants." I realized then that the pneumatic tube had done for Paris what the steam engine had done for the frontier. It had conquered space. But while we used our engines to bring people together, the French used theirs to keep people moving. It is a system designed to facilitate the encounter, that brief, sparkling collision of personalities that the French prize above all else. As I walked out into the bright Parisian afternoon, I looked down at the street. I felt a faint vibration beneath my boots, a subtle, rhythmic thumping that I now recognized as the heartbeat of the city. Down there, in the iron arteries, the canisters were flying. They were carrying the hot things, the insults, the invitations, the betrayals, and the jokes. It is a grand achievement, no doubt, but I could not help but think of the cost of all that speed. In the old days, a secret had a certain shelf life. It had to be carried by hand, which meant it could be intercepted or forgotten or simply lost in the rain. There was a chance for the world to remain quiet for an hour or two, but in the age of the new, the silence is gone. We have traded the peace of the slow world for the thrill of the pressurized secret. We have built a machine that ensures we are never more than 10 minutes away from being disturbed. It is a magnificent art form, to be sure, but like all great art, it is also a bit of a burden. For once you have tasted the speed of a subterranean hurricane, the ordinary wind feels like a personal insult. And once you have received your gossip at 30 miles an hour, the truth, which is always a slow-moving creature, starts to look suspiciously like a failure of the plumbing. Is it possible that the French, in their pursuit of the art of the secret, have forgotten the art of the pause? I suspect so. But then, as any Parisian will tell you, a pause is merely a vacuum waiting to be filled, and they have the pumps, the pipes, and the blue paper to ensure that no vacuum in Paris stays empty for long. Chapter 7. London, the Underground Fog Mover. If a man wishes to understand the British character, he should not look to the Parliament, which is merely a collection of gentlemen trying to out-polite one another until they all fall asleep. Nor should he look to the Tower, which is simply a very old way of being uncomfortable. No, to truly grasp the English soul, he must look at the way they treat their mud. London is not so much a city as it is a collection of fogs that have agreed to reside in the same place for the sake of the commerce. It is a damp, heavy, and soot-stained metropolis where the sun is regarded as a suspicious foreign intruder that only occasionally manages to break through the atmospheric gloom to see if the Queen is still there. Naturally, when a people live in a climate that is essentially a lukewarm sponge, their first instinct is to build everything out of cast iron and bury it as deep as possible. The London Pneumatic Dispatch was born from this very instinct. While the French were using their tubes to whisk love notes through the ether with the grace of a ballet dancer, the English decided to build a subterranean system that was stout, somber, and large enough to swallow a bishop without much effort. I went down to the station at Euston to see this triumph of British determination. I expected a marvel of engineering. What I found was a bronchial condition made of brick and steam. The tubes in London were not the slender, elegant straws of Paris. They were massive, cavernous tunnels of iron 4 feet high and 5 feet wide, designed to carry not just letters, but entire crates of goods, mountains of parcels, and on one or more ill-advised occasions, the operators themselves. There is a story, which the English tell with a great deal of solemn pride, about the day the directors of the company decided to test the system by riding through it. Now, any sensible American, upon being presented with a dark, damp cast-iron pipe and told to lie down in a small cart so he could be sucked through the earth by a distant engine, would immediately go and find a more reliable way to commit suicide. But the English are made of different stuff. They view comfort as a sign of moral decay and danger as an excellent excuse for a cup of tea. They climbed into the car, gentlemen in top hats and frock coats, and were promptly inhaled into the dark. They spent several minutes being rattled through the mud of London, surrounded by the smell of wet soot and the sound of their own prayers, only to emerge at the other end looking like they had been through a coal mine and a shipwreck simultaneously. They climbed out, brushed the grease from their lapels, and declared it most satisfactory. That is the English way. If a thing is sufficiently miserable, it must be useful. The London system, however, had one major adversary that even the British Empire could not colonize: the damp. In London, the underground is not merely a place, it is a state of moisture. The pipes were constantly weeping. The vacuum didn't just pull the canisters, it pulled the fog, the rain, and the general melancholy of the Thames. I spoke to an engineer who looked as though he had been submerged in a barrel of ale and then rolled in a chimney. He informed me that the greatest challenge of the London post was not the machinery, but the atmospheric humidity. "You see, sir," he said, tapping a gauge that was clouded with condensation, "the air in London don't like to be hurried. It's a thick air. It's got tradition in it. You try to suck it through a pipe, and it gets stubborn. It clings to the walls. It tries to turn back into a drizzle." I watched a canister, if you could call a 300-pound iron car a canister, being prepared for its journey. It didn't whistle into the dark like the French knew. It groaned. It gave a long, low, mournful sigh, like a ghost that had just been told it had to work on Sunday. The engine room didn't scream. It rumbled with a deep, subterranean indigestion. The Londoners were determined to move the mail beneath the cobblestones because the traffic above was so thick that a man could grow a beard while waiting to cross the Strand. But the underground was its own kind of prison. The pipes were forever getting clogged with the unauthorized arrivals of the London soil. A leak in the seal meant that the vacuum would start sucking in the Thames, and instead of a parcel of woolens, the station would receive a very surprised eel and 3 gallons of river sludge. There is a peculiar dignity in the way the English fail at things. They don't fail with a bang or a whimper. They fail with determination. They kept the pneumatic dispatch running long after it was clear that it was more expensive than a royal wedding and less efficient than a one-legged messenger. They believed that if they simply made the pipes thicker and the engines louder, they could force the very earth to cooperate. I once asked a clerk at the Holborn station if he thought the system would ever replace the horse. "The horse, sir," he said with a look of profound pity, "is a creature of the surface. He is subject to the weather, the whim, and the appetite. But the tube is British. It is steadfast. It is buried. It doesn't care if it's raining because it's already wet." It was a magnificent sentiment, but a terrible business model. The London system eventually succumbed to the very thing it was built to overcome: the sheer, overwhelming weight of the city. The pipes were too big to be fast and too small to be grand. They sat in the mud, monuments to a dream of subterranean speed, until they were eventually abandoned to the rats and the ghosts of the gentlemen in top hats. But even today, if you stand on a quiet street in London and listen very closely to the fog, you can almost hear it, a faint, distant thump hiss from deep below. It is the sound of the London Underground, still trying to move a letter from 1865 through 40 miles of wet iron. It hasn't arrived yet, and it likely never will. But you can be damn sure that the letter is sitting in its iron car with its collar turned up, being most determinedly and most Britishly late. The Londoners proved that you can build a system for 1,000,000 messages. But if your underground is made of dampness and tradition, you're mostly just moving the fog from one side of town to the other. And in London, there is already quite enough fog to go around without building a pipe to help it travel. Chapter 8. New York's Thirst for Immediacy. New York City is not a place. It is a fever that has taken up residence on a small, cramped island for the purpose of seeing how many people can stand on one another's toes without starting a revolution. It is a city that is perpetually 5 minutes late for an appointment it didn't want to attend in the first place. And as a result, it is possessed by a thirst for immediacy that would make a hummingbird look like a statue. In London, they move the post with a sense of duty. In Paris, they move it with a sense of drama. But in New York, we move it with a sense of panic. We have taken the pneumatic tube, that elegant subterranean straw, and we have turned it into a weapon of war. We have honeycombed the granite of Manhattan with iron pipes, not because we have so much to say, but because we are terrified that someone else might say it first. I stood on the corner of Broadway and Wall Street, the very heart of the American frenzy, and watched the messengers. They do not walk, they vibrate. They are constantly looking at their watches, which I suspect are set 3 minutes fast just to provide an extra layer of unnecessary anxiety. To these people, the pneumatic tube was not an invention. It was a deliverance. It was the only thing in the city capable of keeping pace with the American imagination, which is always 3 miles ahead of its common sense. The American habit is a peculiar thing. We will spend $10 million to build a system capable of transporting 1 million messages an hour. And then we will sit down and realize we only have about 3 things worth saying to one another: buy, sell, and where is my hat? I visited the Central Station at the General Post Office, a building so grand and imposing that it looks like it was designed to house the 10 Commandments, though it mostly handles requests for patent medicines and Sears Roebuck catalogs. There, the tubes arrive with a ferocity that is uniquely American. In the European stations, the canisters arrive with a polite thump or a musical pop. In New York, they arrive with a sound like a gunshot, a violent, brassy bang that says, "Get out of the way, I'm in a hurry." The clerks there don't handle the canisters, they wrestle them. They catch them in leather mitts as they fly out of the muzzles, looking for all the world like a row of desperate baseball players trying to catch a line drive from the Almighty. "What's in that one?" I asked a clerk who had just snatched a canister out of the air with a grace that was truly poetic. "Don't know, mister," he panted, his face red with the exertion of the New York second. "Probably a stock tip, or a grocery list, or a letter from a man in Brooklyn telling a man in Harlem that he's still mad about a horse race in 1842. It doesn't matter what it is, it's got to get there now." That is the American philosophy in a nutshell. The importance of the message is determined entirely by the speed of its arrival. If you send a man a letter by a slow-moving boat, telling him his house is on fire, he will be annoyed by the delay. But if you send him a pneumatic canister at 40 miles an hour, telling him that you think it might rain tomorrow, he will read it with a look of intense, focused concentration, feeling that he has participated in a great moment of progress. We have built a cathedral of speed for a congregation of the trivial. I once knew a speculator on the exchange who was so addicted to the immediacy of the tubes that he wouldn't even talk to his wife across the dinner table. He would write her a note, shove it into a private tube he had installed between the dining room and the kitchen, and wait for the thump of the return canister. "But she's sitting right there," I told him. "You could just ask her for the salt." "Twain," he said with a wild look in his eye, "you don't understand. If I ask her, the salt takes 4 seconds to arrive. If I use the tube, the request is processed, recorded, and delivered with the authority of the machine. It's the efficiency of the thing." He eventually went bankrupt, of course. His efficiency cost him so much in vacuum pump maintenance that he couldn't afford the salt he was so desperate to receive. But he died happy, knowing that his last request for a glass of water had traveled through 400 feet of iron pipe before it reached the nurse. There is a certain tragedy in this thirst. We have become so obsessed with the how of communication that we have entirely forgotten the what. We have created a world where a man can send a thought across a city in the time it takes to sneeze, but he hasn't spent a single second wondering if the thought was worth the air required to move it. I recall a day when a canister got stuck beneath the intersection of 5th Avenue and 23rd Street. For 3 hours, the immediacy of New York was halted. A crowd gathered. Men in high hats paced the sidewalks, looking at the cobblestones as if they could see the blockage with their own eyes. They were frantic. They were lost. They had messages in their pockets that were dying for lack of a vacuum. When the engineers finally cleared the line and the clog was spat out at the station, the crowd cheered. The first canister was opened with the solemnity of a coronation. It contained a single slip of paper. The message read, "The weather in Jersey is damp. Regards, Phil." Phil's dampness had cost the city of New York 3 hours of its collective life and the labor of 20 men. But because it had arrived through a pipe, Phil was considered a man of the era. We are a nation of Phils. We are so proud of our pipes that we have forgotten how to speak. We have mistaken the rushing of the wind for the progress of the soul. We believe that because we can move 1,000,000 messages, we must have 1,000,000 things to say. But if you look closely at the canisters of New York, you will find that most of them are empty. Or worse, they are filled with the kind of frantic, breathless nonsense that only a man in a hurry can produce. New York has its thirst for immediacy, and it has built a magnificent brass-plated fountain to satisfy it. But I fear that the more we drink from the tube, the thirstier we get. For speed is as salt water. The more you consume, the more you crave, until finally you are traveling so fast that you arrive at your destination before you've even left home, and you find that you have nothing to say to the person who is already there waiting for you. Chapter 9. The Theology of the Vacuum. A vacuum, in the scientific sense, is a stretch of territory where the Creator forgot to put anything, and then nature spent the rest of eternity trying to rush back in and fix the mistake. It is an area of pure, unadulterated nothing, a concept that is deeply unsettling to the average man, who feels compelled to fill every empty space in his life with either a piece of furniture, a stray cat, or a bad opinion. But in the world of the Pneumatic Post, the vacuum is not a mistake. It is the Holy Ghost of the machinery. It is the invisible power that draws all things toward it with a yearning that borders on the religious. We have spent millions of dollars to manufacture a void, and in doing so, we have accidentally stumbled upon a profound theological truth, that the world is moved not by what is there, but by what is missing. I have spent many a quiet hour contemplating the nature of the vacuum. Science tells us that nature abhors a vacuum, which is a fancy way of saying that If you leave a hole in the universe will immediately try to stuff it with whatever is lying around, usually dust or a draft or a neighborhood rumor. But I have found that this law of physics does not apply to the human mind, and specifically not to the minds of those who have been elected to high office. In fact, I would go so far as to say that the official mind is the only place in the known universe where a vacuum can exist in a state of perfect, undisturbed tranquility, unaffected by the pressures of reality or the intrusion of common sense. I once had the privilege of interviewing a high-ranking official in Washington, a man whose title was so long it required its own zip code, and whose actual duties were as mysterious as the origins of a boarding house hash. I sat across from him for an hour, and as he spoke, I found myself mesmerized. It wasn't what he said, for he said nothing at all, though he used a prodigious number of words to do it. It was the quality of the emptiness behind his eyes. It was a vacuum of such crystalline purity that I felt a sudden, terrifying urge to check my own pulse to ensure I hadn't been accidentally inhaled. If you were to bore a small hole in that man's temple, I am convinced you would hear the same low, mournful whistle you hear when the wind passes over the mouth of a pneumatic tube. You could fire a brass canister through one of his ears and out the other, and it would arrive at its destination with its seal intact and its contents entirely unmolested by a single passing thought. This is the theology of the vacuum, the realization that emptiness is the most efficient conductor of business. Consider the pneumatic tube itself. If the pipe were full of air, the canister would have to struggle. It would have to argue its way through the atmosphere, pushing and shoving like a man trying to get to the bar at a political convention. But the vacuum offers no resistance. It simply is. It waits with an infinite sucking patience for something to happen, and when the trapdoor opens, it welcomes the canister with a silent, invisible embrace that pulls it through the dark at 30 miles an hour. It is exactly thus in the higher circles of government. If you approach an official with a new idea, or a request for justice, or a plea for sanity, you are essentially trying to shove a canister into a pipe. If that official had a brain full of his own ideas, there would be friction, there would be a collision, there might even be a spark of intelligence, which is a dangerous thing in a bureaucracy. But because the official mind is a vacuum, your request slides right in. It travels through the vast, echoing chambers of his departmental indifference without meeting a single obstacle. It moves with a terrifying velocity toward the out tray, where it is spat into a wire basket and forgotten by sunset. The system is perfect because it is empty. I asked an engineer at the New York station if he believed that a vacuum had a soul. He was a man who had spent 30 years looking for leaks in iron pipes, and he had a face that looked like it had been carved out of a very old and very cynical potato. "A soul, Mr. Twain," he said, wiping a smudge of graphite from his brow. "I don't know about that, but I know it's got a hunger. A vacuum is just a mouth that never gets full. It's always looking for the next thing to swallow. It don't care if it's a love letter or a summons. It just wants to keep the air moving." Therein lies the danger of our modern age. We have become so enamored with the efficiency of the vacuum that we have begun to model our lives after it. We have created a society that prizes the flow above the object. We are so busy building pipes and pumps to move our thoughts that we haven't noticed that the thoughts themselves are becoming as thin and hollow as the air we've sucked out of the tubes. We are reaching a state of mechanical nirvana, where the speed of communication is so great and the resistance of the human mind is so low that information passes through us without leaving a trace. We are becoming a race of pneumatic canisters, shiny on the outside, hollow on the inside, and moving through life at a speed that precludes any possibility of contemplation. I find a certain grim humor in the fact that we use the word aspirations to describe our highest hopes. To aspirate is to suck. It is the very action of the pneumatic pump. We aspire to greatness by creating a vacuum and hoping that something wonderful will be pulled into it. But more often than not, all we manage to pull in is the same old soot and the same old noise, delivered a little faster than it was yesterday. As I look at the great steam-driven pumps of the post office, I cannot help but feel a sense of awe. They are magnificent monuments to our ability to manufacture nothing on a grand scale. They are the iron cathedrals of the vacuum, and as long as we have high-ranking officials to provide the natural equivalent in their own heads, the system will never fail. The canister will fly, the valves will hiss, and the messages of the world will continue to rush through the dark, propelled by the glorious, unblinking power of the great emptiness. It is a comforting thought in a way, for in a world that is often too loud, too crowded, and too full of itself, there is something almost holy about a well-maintained vacuum. It is the only thing in the city that doesn't have an axe to grind, a vote to sell, or a story to tell. It just wants to pull you through to the other side. And in these frantic, hurried times, perhaps that is the most we can ask of any theology, mechanical or otherwise. Chapter 10. The Perils of a High-Speed Sandwich. It is a well-documented fact of history that whenever man invents a new way to move, his first thought is how to use it for glory, his second is how to use it for profit, and his third, usually occurring about 15 minutes after the machinery has been bolted to the floor, is how to use it to deliver his lunch. The pneumatic post was designed by grave men with whiskers the size of shrubberies, who envisioned it as a majestic conduit for the arteries of commerce. They spoke of gold bullion, diplomatic dispatches, and the fluctuating prices of iron ore. But they neglected to account for the most powerful force in the known universe, the hollow stomach of a 16-year-old tube operator who has forgotten his satchel and is currently stationed 3 miles away from a decent deli. In the early days of the New York system, it was discovered that a brass canister, while perfectly suited for a legal brief, is also the exact dimensions of a sturdy ham sandwich, provided one is willing to be somewhat liberal with the application of the mustard. Thus began the era of the unauthorized cargo, a period of subterranean history that the official reports tend to gloss over, but which provides the most accurate measurement of human ingenuity I have yet encountered. I recall an incident involving a particularly ambitious clerk in the Manhattan office who attempted to send a hot oyster stew to a colleague in the Bronx. Now, a man of even moderate intelligence would recognize that a liquid, when subjected to a vacuum at 30 miles an hour, has a tendency to forget its manners. But this clerk was a man of progress. He sealed the stew in a tin, placed it in the canister, and signaled for the suction. The result was a subterranean phenomenon that science is still struggling to categorize. Somewhere beneath 42nd Street, the canister hit a curve with the force of a galloping mule. The seal on the tin, which had not been designed for the rigors of atmospheric combat, gave way. By the time the canister reached the Bronx, the stew was no longer inside it. It had become a fine, briny mist that coated the interior of 3 miles of iron pipe, providing the next 400 letters with a distinct aroma of the sea and a light seasoning of pepper. The recipient in the Bronx opened the canister to find nothing but a damp, lingering sense of disappointment and a faint smell of celery. He wrote back immediately, using the same system, to ask if the stew had arrived in spirit, as it certainly hadn't arrived in body. But sandwiches and stews were merely the beginning. The operators, bored by the relentless arrival of bills and banknotes, began to treat the tubes like a high-speed curiosity shop. I have heard reliable accounts of everything from stolen watches and lost dentures to a single, very confused live lobster being sent through the dark. The lobster, I believe, was the work of a prankster in the London office. It arrived at the receiving station with its claws clicking in a rhythmic, Morse code sort of panic. The clerk who opened the canister was a man of nervous disposition. He took one look at the armored, multi-legged apparition rising from the brass depths, and immediately resigned his position to join the clergy. He claimed it was a sign from the Almighty that the underground was no place for a Christian, and I am inclined to agree with him. If the Lord had intended for lobsters to travel at 30 miles an hour through a pipe, he would have equipped them with felt rings and a more aerodynamic tail. And then, of course, there is the legend of the pneumatic cat. The story goes that in the Paris New, an operator, perhaps motivated by a scientific curiosity, or perhaps merely by a Gallic desire to see something explode, placed a stray tabby into a specially modified ventilated canister. Now, a cat is a creature of high dignity and even higher resentment. To subject such an animal to a subterranean hurricane is to invite a reckoning that no insurance policy can cover. The cat was inhaled at the Place de l'Opéra. It traveled 2 miles in the dark, presumably contemplating the many ways it intended to murder its captor once the journey was over. When the canister reached its destination and the trapdoor opened, the cat did not merely emerge, it erupted. It was a blur of fur, claws, and French profanity that cleared the office in under 4 seconds. The official report stated that the cat appeared agitated but unharmed. I suspect this was an understatement. I have known cats. A cat that has been sucked through a pipe is not merely agitated. It is a 4-legged engine of vengeance. That cat likely spent the rest of its 9 lives haunting the dreams of pneumatic engineers and waiting for the day when it could push a human being into a very large straw. The perils of the high-speed sandwich are, at their heart, a commentary on the vanity of the machine. We build these systems for the sublime, but we use them for the ridiculous. We create a vacuum capable of moving the secrets of nations, and then we use it to transport a half-eaten apple because we are too lazy to walk up a flight of stairs. I once saw a canister arrive at the New York station that had been stuffed with a dozen roses. It was a romantic gesture, I suppose, a gentleman trying to surprise his lady with the speed of his affection. But the vacuum is not a romantic creature. It is a brute. It had sucked the life out of those roses with such enthusiasm that by the time they reached the lady, they looked like they had been through a laundry wringer and then trampled by a circus parade. They were beautiful when I sent them, the gentleman insisted. "Perhaps," the lady replied, holding the bedraggled stems as if they were evidence in a murder trial. But by the time they got here, they'd clearly decided that love wasn't worth the pressure. That is the moral of the unauthorized cargo. Speed is a fine thing for a stock tip, and it is a necessary thing for a fire alarm, but there are certain things in this world that were meant to move at the pace of a human being. A sandwich is a better sandwich when it has had time to sit quietly in a basket. A rose is a better rose when it has been carried by a hand that cares for its thorns. And a cat, well, a cat should never be in a pipe, under any circumstances, unless the pipe is made of salmon and is currently at rest. We are a race of creatures who cannot leave well enough alone. We see a hole, and we must stuff it. We see a wind, and we must harness it. We see a high-speed delivery system, and we must see if it can handle a slice of pie. It is this quality that makes us magnificent, and it is also the quality that ensures we will always be covered in mustard. As the tubes continue to hiss and the canisters continue to thump, remember the unauthorized cargoes. They are the true record of our progress. For while the historians will talk of the information age, the pipes themselves remember the oyster stew, the lobster, and the very angry cat, and they know that no matter how fast we move, we are still just a collection of hungry, bored, and mischievous children, trying to see how much we can get away with before the chief engineer comes back from his lunch. Chapter 11. The Correspondence of the Comet. There is a widespread and most persistent delusion among the members of the human race. A race, I might add, that is already prone to believing that the moon is made of green cheese, if you tell them with enough conviction that the velocity of a man's communication is a direct reflection of the quality of his intellect. We have come to believe that if a message travels at the speed of a comet, the man who wrote it must possess the brilliance of a star. I have spent a lifetime observing the brilliant men of our age, and I have found that more often than not, a comet is merely a common rock that has had the good fortune to catch fire. It isn't any smarter than the pebble in your shoe. It just has a more spectacular way of announcing its arrival. And so it is with the correspondence of the comet, the frantic, high-speed messages that whistle through the pneumatic tubes of our great cities. In the old days, when a man sat down to write a letter, he was engaged in a slow and solemn contract with his own conscience. He had to find a pen, he had to hunt for the inkwell, and he had to wait for the paper to dry. This gave him a providential interval in which to realize that he was being a fool. By the time the ink was dry, the man had usually decided that calling his brother-in-law a bilious toad was perhaps a bit strong, and he would rewrite the sentence to suggest that his relative was merely misguided. The delay was the guardian of the peace, but the pneumatic tube has murdered the delay. It has provided us with a way to deliver our half-baked thoughts while they are still steaming from the oven of our tempers. We have traded the reflection of the candle for the correspondence of the comet, and the results are exactly as disastrous as one might expect when you fire a rock through a pipe. I recall the case of one Silas P. Barnaby, a man of electric reflexes and microscopic judgment, who lived in a state of perpetual acceleration. Silas was a great believer in the tubes. He felt that to wait an hour for a reply was a personal insult from the universe. He spent his days firing canisters back and forth across Manhattan, convinced that his frantic activity was a sign of his immense importance to the world of commerce. One afternoon, Silas received a message from a business rival, a man named Higgins, concerning a certain shipment of Kansas wheat. The message was slightly ambiguous, as messages often are when they are written by men in a hurry. Silas, being a comet man, didn't stop to think. He didn't ask for clarification. He didn't even take a breath. He grabbed a slip of paper, scrawled a blistering reply that questioned Higgins's ancestry, his honesty, and the structural integrity of his nose, and shoved it into the canister. Pop, hiss, thump. The comet was launched. 10 seconds later, Silas realized that he had misread the original note. Higgins hadn't been insulting him. He had been offering him a profit of $4,000. Now, in a slower world, Silas would have had to walk to the post office. He would have had a chance to trip over a dog or see a pretty girl, or be struck by a sudden and merciful bolt of common sense. But in the world of the tube, his idiocy was already halfway to its destination. Silas spent the next 4 hours engaged in what I call the breathless apology. He sent a second canister to explain the first, then he sent a third to apologize for the tone of the second. By the time the sun went down, Silas had sent 14 canisters, spent $8 in postage, and managed to convince Higgins that he was not merely a comet man, but a full-blown lunatic. This is the true legacy of high-speed communication. It doesn't make us smarter. It only makes our mistakes more frequent and our apologies more breathless. We are so busy sending the next message that we haven't the time to ensure the last one made any sense. We have created a system that demands a constant supply of instant opinion. And since the human mind is not designed to produce wisdom on demand, we fill the canisters with the first thing that falls out of our heads. If you take a dull, unremarkable thought and fire it through a pipe at 40 miles an hour, it does not become a profound insight by the time it reaches the other end. It is still a dull, unremarkable thought. It is simply a thought that is now in a tearing hurry to annoy someone. I have noticed that the men who have the most worth saying are usually the ones who are the most willing to wait. A philosopher does not use a pneumatic tube. A poet does not entrust his soul to a vacuum pump. They know that the truth is a slow-moving creature. It likes to take the scenic route. It prefers the horse to the hurricane. But we, the modern, the enlightened, the hurried, we worship the comet. We brag about how many messages we can send in an hour, as if the volume of our noise were a measure of our harmony. We have built a civilization that is perfectly capable of delivering a lie around the world in a minute, but hasn't yet found a way to make the truth travel any faster than it did in the days of Socrates. I stood in the New York station and watched the comets arriving. Each one brought a sense of urgency. Each one demanded immediate attention. But as I watched the clerks open them, I saw that most of the messages were nothing more than the scrapings of a distracted mind. They were the breathless products of men who felt that because the system was fast, they had to be fast too. It is a tragedy of the first order. We have conquered the vacuum, we have harnessed the steam, and we have bored through the earth, all so that Silas P. Barnaby can tell Higgins he is a bilious toad 10 seconds faster than he could have said it yesterday. As we move further into this age of iron and air, I fear we are losing the luxury of the pause. We are forgetting that the most important part of any conversation is the silence that allows the other man's words to sink in. We are replacing the conversation of the heart with the correspondence of the comet. And we are finding that while the tail is very bright and the speed is very great, the center is nothing but a cold, hard stone. So, the next time you feel the urge to send a message at the speed of light, I beg of you, wait, sit down, look at a tree, talk to a dog. Give your thought a chance to put its boots on and see if it still looks like a good idea in 20 minutes. For if you fire your comet too soon, you will find that you spend the rest of your life running after it with a shovel, trying to clean up the mess it made when it hit the ground. Chapter 12. The Steam Engine as a Postmaster. It is a common habit of the human race to bestow its gratitude upon the most visible and least deserving objects of its affection. We build statues to generals who merely stood on a hill and watched their men get shot. We name streets after politicians who never did anything more strenuous than change their minds. And we treat the Postmaster General as if he were the very fountainhead of our correspondence, simply because he has a clean collar and a desk made of something other than a packing crate. But if you want to find the true postmaster, the one who actually does the work, who never sleeps, who never complains about his salary, and who doesn't spend his afternoons trying to figure out how to get elected to the Senate, you must leave the mahogany offices and descend into the greasy, thumping, steam-clouded purgatory of the engine room. There you will find him, the steam engine. He is a massive, iron-ribbed, soot-streaked deity of the underworld, and he is the only thing in the city that truly understands the value of a deadline. A human postmaster is a creature of whim. He is subject to the weather, the gout, and the temptation of a long lunch. If he is feeling out of sorts, your letter stays on the pile. But a steam engine has no whims. He has only a hunger for coal and a commitment to the piston. I have spent a considerable amount of time in the company of these greasy heroes, and I have come to believe that the steam engine is the highest form of life yet achieved on this planet. It is certainly more reliable than a man, and it is infinitely more honest than a horse. A horse will pretend to be lame if it doesn't like the look of a hill, but a steam engine will work until its very heart bursts, provided you keep its joints supple and its belly full of fire. The anatomy of our mechanical postmaster is a study in brutal efficiency. First, there is the boiler, the great iron stomach where the black rocks of the earth are converted into the white breath of the machine. It is a place of perpetual fury, held in check only by a few inches of steel and the watchful eye of a man like McSweeney, who treats a pressure gauge with more reverence than a bishop treats a Bible. Then there is the piston. This is the iron arm of the law. It moves back and forth with a rhythmic, hypnotic violence, pushing the air, pulling the vacuum, and ensuring that the world's nonsense keeps moving at 30 miles an hour. There is a magnificent arrogance in the stroke of a piston. It doesn't ask permission to move. It simply demands that the universe get out of the way. And finally, there is the valve, the brain of the operation. The valve is a subtle, sliding thing that decides when to breathe and when to hold its breath. It is the diplomat of the engine room. It manages the temperamental relationship between the steam and the cylinder with a precision that would put a Swiss watchmaker to shame. I watched a great horizontal coreless engine at work in the heart of the London system. It was a beautiful, terrifying thing to behold. The flywheel was 20 feet across, a blur of polished steel that hummed with the sound of 1,000 bees. Every time that wheel turned, a mile of subterranean tubing was scoured by a vacuum so powerful it could likely pull the buttons off a man's coat from 3 blocks away. "Does he ever get tired?" I asked the stoker, a man who appeared to be made entirely of anthracite and perspiration. "Tired?" the stoker shouted over the roar of the furnaces. "Mister, he don't know the meaning of the word. As long as I feed him, he pushes. He's been pushing since the Jubilee, and he'll be pushing when we're all in the boneyard. He's got the soul of a debt collector. He never lets go until he's got what's coming to him." This is the greasy hero of the information age. We like to think of our messages as ethereal things, as thoughts that fly through the air on the wings of progress. We want to believe that our communication is clean, elegant, and modern. But the reality is that every love letter, every stock tip, and every wish you were here is moved by the sweat of a stoker and the grunt of a piston. The sublime is built upon the sooty. We owe a debt of gratitude to the valve and the piston that we can never repay, for they are the ones who have liberated us from the tyranny of the slow world. They have taken the heavy, plodding business of the post and turned it into a high-speed, steam-driven miracle. And they do it without any hope of a pension, a medal, or even a kind word. I once saw a clerk in a New York station pat a pneumatic muzzle as a canister arrived. It was a rare gesture of affection for the machinery. "Good old Bessie," he muttered. "Who's Bessie?" I asked. "Your sweetheart?" "No," he said, nodding toward the floor. "The engine in the basement. She's been thumping since 6 this morning. If she stops, I got to go back to walking the mail, and my corns won't stand for it. Bessie's the best postmaster I ever had. She don't talk back, she don't take holidays, and she's the only lady I know who can handle a vacuum without losing her head." There is a profound lesson in that. We live in an age of unsung heroes. We admire the bridge, but we forget the caisson. We marvel at the skyscraper, but we ignore the foundation, and we celebrate the post, but we neglect the engine. But I, for one, shall always raise my hat to the steam engine. He is the true postmaster of the Victorian world. He is the greasy, rhythmic, unblinking heartbeat of our civilization. And as long as he continues to breathe his white breath into our iron pipes, the hurricane will continue to blow, the canisters will continue to fly, and the human race will continue to be able to deliver its mistakes to its neighbors with a speed and a noise that would have made our ancestors think the end of the world had arrived. So here's to the piston. May its stroke be long. Here's to the valve. May its seal be tight. And here's to the steam engine, the only postmaster in history who ever truly understood that in this world, if you aren't moving at 30 miles an hour, you might as well be standing still. Chapter 13. A City Honeycombed with Ambition. If you were to take a common everyday New Yorker, a man whose primary interests are the price of stocks, the quality of his whiskey, and the speed at which he can avoid his creditors, and inform him that the very ground beneath his expensive leather boots is about as solid as a Swiss cheese that has been left in a room full of hungry mice, he would likely treat you with a profound and well-earned suspicion. We like to believe that the earth is the one thing in this world that stays put. We build our cathedrals upon it. We anchor our skyscrapers into its granite ribs, and we walk upon its surface with the arrogant confidence of a man who believes he is standing on a mountain, but the truth is far more porous. We have lived through an era where the engineer has replaced the philosopher as the architect of our reality, and the engineer's first instinct upon encountering a piece of solid ground is to see if he can't find a way to bore a hole through it. The modern city is no longer a solid object. It is a honeycomb. Beneath the cobblestones, the earth has been hollowed out, tunneled through, and laced with so many iron arteries that I sometimes wonder if the only thing keeping the streets from collapsing into the abyss is the sheer, stubborn pressure of the debt that is currently flying through the pipes. I have stood on a quiet corner of Broadway at midnight when the omnibuses have ceased their rattling and the city has momentarily run out of breath. And I have listened. If you press your ear to the cold iron of a lamppost, you can hear it, a low, mournful, whistling sound that vibrates through the very soles of your feet. It is the music of the great subterranean flute. Imagine, if you will, that the earth beneath our feet is a giant hollow instrument, a flute of epic proportions, with miles of cast iron tubing serving as the barrel and the various mail stations acting as the stops. And who is the musician playing this monstrous thing? It is the god of commerce. He is a frantic, wild-eyed deity who doesn't know the meaning of a rest note. He blows through the pipes with the breath of a steam engine, and the music he produces is not a lullaby. It is a frantic, screeching jig of ambition. Every thump of a canister is a drumbeat, every hiss of a valve is a sharp staccato note, and every subterranean hurricane is a long, wailing crescendo that signals another $1,000 has changed hands, or another reputation has been sucked into the dark. We have honeycombed the city because we are a race of creatures who are no longer content to live on the surface of things. We have a thirst for the interior. We want to know what is happening behind the walls, beneath the floors, and inside the very bedrock of our existence. We believe that if we can just move our thoughts and our money through the earth itself, we will somehow become as immortal and as unshakable as the stone we are hollowing out. There is a certain vanity in this ambition. We think that by building a subterranean empire, we are conquering nature. We feel that because we have turned the mud into a post office, we have finally put the earth in its place. But I cannot help but think that nature is merely biding her time. She is a patient landlady, and she is watching us bore our holes and lay our pipes with the quiet amusement of a woman watching a child try to build a sand castle in the middle of a rising tide. I spoke to a surveyor once, a man who spent his days measuring the voids beneath the city. He was a melancholy soul, as men who spend too much time in the dark often are. "It's all hollow, Mr. Twain," he told me, shaking his head. "From the Battery to Harlem, it's a laced doily of iron and air. We've dug for the subway, we've dug for the sewers, we've dug for the gas, and now we've dug for the post. There's more air under New York than there is above it." "Is it dangerous?" I asked. "Not if you stay in a hurry," he said. "The city only stays up because it hasn't the time to fall down. It's too busy rushing from one side of the island to the other. But if the world ever stopped for a minute, if the pumps ever failed and the vacuum went out of the pipes, I reckon the whole business would just fold up like a wet cardboard box." That is the true nature of our honeycombed ambition. It is a system that depends entirely on its own momentum. We have built a city that is literally held together by its own haste. As long as the canisters are flying and the steam is pushing, the flute keeps playing. But the moment the music stops, the silence will be deafening, and the weight of all that hollowed-out granite will start to look very heavy indeed. I look at the men who walk the streets today, the bankers with their gold chains, the clerks with their ink-stained fingers, and the ladies with their parasols, and I see that they are entirely unaware of the iron flute beneath their feet. They think they are walking on solid ground. They don't realize that they are actually skimming across the surface of a giant mechanical lung that is breathing their secrets back and forth at 30 miles an hour. We have sacrificed the solidity of the earth for the velocity of our desires. We have decided that it is better to be a hollow city that moves at the speed of light than a solid town that moves at the speed of a horse. It is a magnificent achievement, to be sure. It is a testament to the fact that when man wants to tell his neighbor a lie about the price of corn, there is no obstacle, not even the very crust of the planet, that he will not find a way to bore through. But sometimes, in the middle of the night, when I hear that low whistle coming up from the sewers, I can't help but wonder what the god of commerce is planning for his final movement. A flute, after all, is only a piece of wood or metal with holes in it. The beauty of the music depends entirely on the player, and if the player is a deity whose only interest is more, faster, and now, I fear that the finale of the song might be a bit more discordant than we are prepared for. For now, however, the honeycomb is thriving. The pipes are warm, the canisters are polished, and the ambition of the city continues to flow through the dark like a subterranean river of brass and air. We are a hollow people living in a hollow city, and as long as the music keeps playing, we are perfectly happy to pretend that the ground beneath our feet is as solid as the day it was made. Just don't stop moving, I beg of you. For in a city made of whistles and vacuums, the only way to keep from falling through the floor is to ensure that you are always at least 10 seconds ahead of the gravity. Chapter 14. The Physics of the Whispered Rumor. There is a popular notion among the men of science, those venerable gentlemen who spend their lives measuring things that cannot be seen and explaining things that cannot be understood. That light is the fastest traveler in the universe. They will sit you down and, with a straight face and a terrifying array of chalkboards, inform you that a beam of light can circle the globe 7 times in a single second. This is all very impressive, I suppose, if you are a beam of light with a pressing engagement on the other side of the planet. But for the rest of us, it is merely a bit of academic humbug. In my experience, there is one thing that travels considerably faster than light, and it doesn't require a single spark of electricity to do it. I am speaking, of course, of the whispered rumor. A rumor is a peculiar physical phenomenon. It doesn't follow the laws of gravity. It ignores the boundaries of logic, and it has a way of expanding in volume the further it travels from the truth. But until the arrival of the pneumatic post, the rumor was a terrestrial creature. It had to walk. It had to sit in a parlor and wait for the tea to be poured. It had to linger at the street corner and wait for a sympathetic ear. It was limited by the speed of the human tongue, which, while remarkably agile, is still subject to the occasional need for a glass of water. But then came the first fiber optic network. Of course, in the 1870s, our fiber was made of 4-inch thick cast iron, and our optics were entirely, resolutely, and hopelessly pitch black. The pneumatic tube took the organic, slow-growing rumor of the village square and turned it into a pressurized projectile. We discovered that if you take a bit of scandal, say, the news that the local temperance union president was seen entering a distillery through the coal chute, and you stuff it into a brass canister, the vacuum will strip away all the unnecessary details and deliver the pure concentrated essence of the catastrophe to the other end of town before the distillery door has even finished swinging. I once observed a rumor in mid-flight at the New York Central Station. It was a marvelous study in high-speed acoustics. A canister arrived with a particularly sharp whack, and the clerk, a man whose ears were so large they seemed to be designed specifically for the interception of other people's business, unrolled the message with a grin that could have lit up a cellar. "What's the news?" I asked. "The mayor," he whispered, his eyes gleaming in the gaslight. "They say he's been caught trying to bribe a statue in City Hall Park." "A statue?" I said. "That seems a bit redundant even for a politician." "Doesn't matter," the clerk said, already stuffing the note into the tube for the uptown line. "By the time this gets to Harlem, the statue will have accepted the bribe, and the mayor will be halfway to Mexico with a bronze nymph. This is the physics of the whispered rumor. In a pneumatic system, the message is subjected to a pressure that would crush a diamond, and the result is a total evaporation of the facts. When a rumor travels through a pitch-black pipe at 30 miles an hour, it doesn't need optics. It doesn't need to see where it's going, because it is being pulled by the vacuum of human curiosity, a force that is infinitely more powerful than the suction of any steam engine yet devised. We call our modern systems information networks. But that is a polite fiction. They are actually indignation networks. The pneumatic tube was the first machine that allowed a man to be offended by something that hadn't even happened yet. It allowed a rumor to arrive at its destination with such speed and such force that it carried its own proof. The recipient thinks to himself, "If it came this fast through a hole in the ground, it must be true." It is a curious thing about the human mind. We trust anything that arrives with a thump. We suspect the man who walks up to us and tells us a story to our face. We look at his eyes. We check for a smirk. We weigh his words against his reputation. But when a brass cylinder spits out a piece of paper, we treat it with the reverence due to a tablet from Sinai. The iron pipe lends a certain mechanical dignity to the most outrageous lies. I have often thought that the fiber-optic future the scientists dream of, a world where light carries our thoughts through glass threads, will be a very lonely place. For light is a clean thing. It reveals the truth. It illuminates the corners. But the pneumatic tube was a dark thing. It was a place of shadows and soot, perfectly suited for the transport of the whispered secret. There is a comfort in the dark of the pipe. It allows the rumor to grow and change as it travels. It enters the tube as a misunderstanding over a grocery bill, and it emerges at the other end as the greatest financial swindle since the South Sea bubble. The cast iron protects the secret from the prying eyes of common sense until it is too late for the truth to catch up. I asked an engineer if he ever worried about the moral implications of the vacuum. "Moral implications, Mr. Twain?" he asked, tapping a pressure gauge. "I don't deal in morals. I deal in pounds per square inch. If the message is a lie, it moves at the same speed as the truth. My job is to make sure the air don't leak. If the world wants to use my pipes to tell each other that the moon has been sold to a syndicate in New Jersey, that's their business. I just provide the wind. And that, I suppose, is the final word on the physics of the matter. We have built a magnificent, lightless network of iron veins, and we have filled it with the wind of our own vanity. We have created a system where the optics are pitch black, ensuring that we never have to see the consequences of our haste. We are very proud of our fiber optic ancestors. We brag about the speed, we marvel at the vacuum, and we celebrate the hurricane in a pipe. But let us not forget that while light may be the fastest thing in the universe, the whispered rumor is the only thing that can arrive at its destination and have the furniture moved, the bags packed, and the scandal published before the light has even found its boots. Chapter 15. The Great Obstruction of 1872. In the history of every great civilization, there comes a moment of profound and paralyzing silence, a moment when the machinery of progress grinds to a halt, and man is forced to realize that he is not the master of the universe, but merely a tenant in a building with very temperamental plumbing. For the Roman Empire, it was the arrival of the Goths. For the French monarchy, it was the shortage of cake. And for the city of New York, in the year of our Lord 1872, it was the Great Obstruction. Now, to the uninitiated, an obstruction in a 4-inch iron pipe might seem a trivial affair, a minor inconvenience on par with a lost button or a rainy Tuesday. But to a city that has hitched its soul to the wagon of subterranean suction, a stuck canister is not a nuisance. It is a stroke. It is a blood clot in the iron artery of commerce. It happened on a Tuesday morning, a day that began with all the usual frantic promise of the Gilded Age. The pumps were wheezing, the boilers were screaming, and the air was thick with the smell of coal and the anticipation of profit. Thousands of canisters were flying through the dark, carrying the lifeblood of the city. And then, at exactly 10:14 a.m., the pulse stopped. Somewhere beneath the intersection of Broadway and Liberty Street, or perhaps it was Maiden Lane, or maybe it was halfway to China, a canister decided it had traveled quite far enough. Perhaps it was a particularly heavy canister laden with the legal densities of a corporate merger. Or perhaps it was a canister whose felt rings had grown weary of the friction. Or perhaps, as I suspect, it was simply a canister that had developed a sudden philosophical objection to being a projectile. Whatever the cause, it stopped, and because a pneumatic tube is a world without a passing lane, every canister behind it stopped as well. The sudden silence of ambition. The effect was instantaneous and terrifying. In the mail stations, the muzzles that usually spat out brass pills with the rhythm of a machine gun suddenly fell silent. The operators stood frozen, their levers in hand, waiting for a thump that never came. The vacuum gauges, which usually danced with the excitement of the hunt, began to quiver and drop, indicating that the great emptiness was no longer moving. Within 20 minutes, the frantic desire of the city had backed up for 3 miles. The silence was not peaceful. It was a heavy, suffocating thing. It was the sound of 1,000 unread secrets, 10,000 uncollected debts, and one very important request for a fresh batch of crumpets, all trapped in the iron dark, waiting for a breath that wouldn't come. The chief engineer, a man whose nerves were held together by nothing but coffee and a sense of impending doom, was summoned from his breakfast. He arrived at the central station looking like a man who had just been told his mother-in-law was moving in for the summer. "Where is it?" he demanded, staring at the dead muzzles. "Somewhere between here and the North Pole, sir," the operator replied, his voice trembling. "We've got vacuum at the Battery and pressure at Canal Street, but nothing is moving in the middle. The city's heart has stopped beating, and I reckon it's got a piece of gristle stuck in its throat." The physics of the frantic search. Then began the Great Search, a scientific endeavor that combined the precision of a surgeon with the guesswork of a man looking for a black cat in a coal cellar at midnight. How do you find a 6-inch brass cylinder trapped in 5 miles of buried iron? You cannot see it. You cannot smell it. And if you try to talk to it, it doesn't answer. You are forced to rely on the acoustics of desperation. The pistol shot method. The engineers fired a blank pistol into the mouth of the tube and timed the echo with a stopwatch. They figured that if they knew the speed of sound and the time it took for the bang to hit the obstruction and bounce back, they could calculate the distance to the inch. It was a beautiful theory, ruined only by the fact that a pneumatic tube is an echo chamber of such demonic complexity that a single pistol shot sounds like a cavalry charge in a cathedral. The engineers ended up with 20 different distances ranging from right under the floor to somewhere in the middle of the Atlantic. The chemical detection. They tried releasing a canister filled with a particularly pungent perfume, hoping to smell where the air was leaking. This resulted in the entire financial district smelling like a French bordello for 3 days, but it did nothing to locate the blockage. The mechanical ferret. They even considered sending a small, highly trained dog through the pipe with a string tied to its tail, but the SPCA intervened, claiming that while the dog might find the canister, it would likely lose its dignity in the process. The city watched the search with a morbid fascination. Groups of businessmen gathered around the manhole covers, peering into the dark, as if they expected the stuck canister to suddenly realize its mistake and climb out of its own accord. The newspapers ran headlines about the apoplexy of the iron vein, and the price of stamps plummeted as the public realized that, for the first time in a decade, a horse was once again the fastest thing in New York. The miracle of the mallet. The obstruction was finally located, not by a scientist with a stopwatch or a chemist with a perfume bottle, but by a common laborer named O'Malley, who possessed a keen ear and a very heavy wooden mallet. O'Malley walked the length of the line, tapping on the iron pipes through the cellar walls of the buildings along Broadway. He listened to the ring of the metal, ting, 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 and then, in a damp basement beneath a haberdashery, he heard it, thud. It was a dull, heavy sound, the sound of a pipe that was no longer full of air, but full of brass and frustration. O'Malley turned to the chief engineer, who was hovering behind him like a nervous hen. "She's right here, sir," O'Malley said, patting the iron. "Caught in a curve, looking for all the world like a man who's tried to swallow a potato whole and found his neck wasn't up to the challenge." They had to dig up the street. They had to break the seal of the holy pipe. And when they finally extracted the offending canister, the crowd that had gathered on the sidewalk cheered as if they were witnessing the return of a conquering hero. The chief engineer opened the canister with trembling hands. The city held its breath. What was the great message that had paralyzed the metropolis? What was the secret that had stopped the heart of New York? He pulled out a small wrinkled slip of paper. It was a note from one clerk to another, sent 3 hours earlier. It read, "Joe, the boss is in a foul mood today. Don't mention the oysters." The moral of the Iron Heart. The Great Obstruction of 1872 taught us a lesson that we have been trying to forget ever since, that the more complex we make our lives, the more we are at the mercy of the smallest things. We build $1 million system to move our thoughts, and then we find that the whole business can be brought to its knees by a single piece of advice about a plate of oysters. We like to think of our cities as great, invincible organisms, as machines that can never fail. But beneath the surface, we are always just one thud away from silence. We are a people who have honeycombed the earth with our ambition, only to find that when the heart stops, we haven't the slightest idea how to make it beat again without the help of a man with a wooden mallet. The pulse eventually returned. The pumps were restarted, the vacuum was restored, and the canisters began to fly once more. But for those of us who lived through the silence, the city never felt quite so solid again. We had seen the tragedy of the stuck canister, and we knew that no matter how fast we move, we are always just a heartbeat away from the dark, cold realization that the hurricane in a pipe is only as strong as the smallest thing that tries to stand in its way. Chapter 16, The Romance of the Iron Artery. There is a particular kind of intoxication that takes hold of the human mind when it encounters a new way to avoid walking. It is a mechanical romance, a brief and shining delirium where we convince ourselves that we have finally discovered the secret to a frictionless existence. For a few glorious years in the late 19th century, the world fell head over heels in love with the iron pipe. We didn't just want to send our mail through it, we wanted to send the entire physical world through it. We truly believed that if we could only build a pump of sufficient ferocity, we could ship everything from a grand piano to a Sunday roast through a hole in the ground, thereby bypassing the twin curses of gravity and the weather. It was a beautiful dream, a vision of a tubular utopia. We imagined a city where the streets were silent and empty, because the entire business of living had been moved 5 feet underground. We saw a future where a man didn't have to go to the market. The market, in the form of a series of brass canisters, would come to him. We envisioned a house where the walls were a honeycomb of pipes delivering hot coffee, fresh laundry, and the morning news with the rhythmic regularity of a heartbeat. The high priest of this romance was a gentleman named Alfred Ely Beach. Now, Beach was a man of prodigious imagination and subterranean tendencies. He looked at the congested streets of New York, streets so choked with horses, omnibuses, and mud that it was often faster to crawl to your destination on your hands and knees than to take a carriage. And he had a revelation. He decided that if a letter could travel through a tube, there was no reason a human being couldn't do the same. In 1870, under the cover of darkness and using a permit for a small pneumatic mail line as a legal fig leaf, Beach secretly built a tunnel beneath Broadway. It was the first pneumatic subway, and it was a masterpiece of Victorian audacity. He didn't just dig a hole, he built a palace. The waiting room was adorned with easy chairs, a grand piano, and a fountain filled with goldfish. Because, as every engineer knows, nothing settles the nerves of a man about to be sucked through a pipe quite like a goldfish. The car was a plush, circular carriage that fit the tunnel like a cork in a bottle. When the giant steam-driven fan, a monster known as the Western Tornado, was turned on, it blew the car down the tracks. When the fan was reversed, it sucked the car back. I had the privilege of seeing this marvel. There is something profoundly humbling about sitting in a velvet chair while the breath of a giant shoves you through the dark. It is the only time in my life I have felt like a pea in a blowgun, and I must say the sensation is surprisingly aristocratic. For a few cents, a New Yorker could experience the romance of the iron artery, traveling one block in total subterranean comfort, entirely oblivious to the fact that they were participating in a mechanical hallucination. The public went mad for it. They saw Beach's tunnel and immediately assumed that within 10 years, the entire human race would be tubular. They imagined pneumatic lines crossing the Atlantic, carrying passengers from New York to London in a single, long, breathless gasp. They spoke of pneumatic cities built in the desert, where every necessity of life was delivered by vacuum. It was the era of the universal pipe. We believed that the iron artery was the solution to every human ill. Trash. Put it in a pipe and suck it into the sea. Coal. Grind it up and blow it into the cellar. The mother-in-law? Well, the engineers were still working on a canister of sufficient volume, but the ambition was certainly there. We were convinced that we could distill the physical world into a series of projectiles. We wanted to eliminate the surface of life, the dust, the noise, the slow-moving crowds, and replace it with the clean, hidden efficiency of the vacuum. It was a romance born of our impatience. We have always been a race that prefers the shortcut to the scenic route, and the pneumatic tube was the ultimate shortcut. It was a straight line through a crooked world. But like all romances, the love affair with the iron artery was eventually forced to confront the stubborn realities of the physical world. You see, the problem with shipping the world through a pipe is that the world is a very knobby, irregular, and uncooperative place. A letter is a compliant cargo. It doesn't mind being curled. But a human being has bones, a grand piano has corners, and a Sunday roast has a stubborn tendency to leave grease on the walls of the artery, which over time turns the tubular utopia into a very long and very inaccessible frying pan. Furthermore, we discovered that while a vacuum is a magnificent power, it is also an expensive one. To move a man one block by air requires enough steam and coal to move a train 10 miles by rail. We were trying to use a hurricane to do the work of a pony, and eventually the ledger books began to scream louder than the air pumps. The brief, shining moment began to fade. Beach's subway was shut down, not by a failure of the imagination, but by a failure of the political plumbing of Tammany Hall. The grand visions of transatlantic tubes and tubular cities were filed away in the cabinet of magnificent humbugs right next to the plans for the perpetual motion machine and the map to the fountain of youth. We realized with a certain melancholy that we were destined to remain surface dwellers. We were forced to accept that the earth is not a flute and that a man is not a projectile. We returned to our horses, our mud, and our slow-moving crowds, leaving the iron arteries to the letters and the telegrams. But oh, what a romance it was! There is a lingering ghost of that ambition still haunting our cities. Every time you see a pneumatic tube in a bank or hospital, You're looking at a fragment of a dream that once tried to swallow the world. It is a reminder of that Victorian hubris, that wonderful idiotic belief that if we only built the pump large enough, we could ship our very souls through a pipe and arrive at the gates of heaven with a satisfying thump and a clean seal. We have moved on to other romances, of course. We have fallen in love with the wire, the wing, and the invisible signal. But I sometimes look at the cobblestones and wonder what it would be like if we had succeeded. I imagine a world where we are all projectiles of progress, whistling through the dark at 30 miles an hour, forever avoided by the rain and forever in a hurry to get to the next station. It would be a very efficient world, no doubt, but I suspect it would be a very lonely one, too. For in the romance of the iron artery, there is no room for the scenery, no time for the sun, and absolutely no place for a man to stop and change his mind. If we could truly ship our physical selves through a pipe today, teleportation, if you will, do you think we'd be any happier, or would we just find a way to be bored in two places at once? Chapter 17. The Electricity Killers. Just as man had finally perfected the art of boring holes through the world, just as we had mastered the subterranean hurricane and taught the very earth how to inhale our correspondence, along came the electricity killers to ruin the fun. They arrived not with the majestic roar of a steam engine or the satisfying clack of a brass canister, but with the silent, insidious twitching of a wire. They were the lightning tamers, a breed of men who had discovered that you didn't need a 5-ton air pump to move a thought if you were willing to turn that thought into a series of ghostly stutters. They called it the electric telegram. And for those of us who had grown fond of the physical thumping reality of the pneumatic post, it felt like being told that the grand banquet we were attending was being replaced by a single, invisible pill that tasted of copper and disappointment. I have always been a man who prefers a heavy fact to a light fancy. A pneumatic canister is a fact. You can hold it in your hand. You can hear it arrive. If it strikes you on the shin, you will have a bruise that testifies to its existence for a fortnight. But a telegram? A telegram is a ghost. It is a message that has been stripped of its body, flayed of its paper, and sent shivering across a wire like a soul, being hurried through a lightning storm. The rivalry between the pipe and the wire was a battle between the physical and the spectral. The proponents of electricity, men with wild hair and a disturbing habit of touching metal objects to see if they would spark, spoke of instantaneous communication. They bragged that they didn't need a vacuum, they didn't need a brass vessel, and they certainly didn't need a boy with a lever and a ham sandwich. Mr. Twain, one of these electric enthusiasts, told me, "The age of the projectile is over. We are now in the age of the impulse. We can send a word from New York to San Francisco in the time it takes you to blink." "That is all very well," I replied, "but can you send a bunch of roses by impulse? Can you send a hot oyster stew by electricity? Can you send a cat through a wire without turning it into a very small and very permanent smell of singed fur?" He had no answer for that, of course. The electricity killers were experts at moving the what, but they were entirely helpless when it came to moving the thing. There is a profound indignity in the telegraph. It reduces the English language, that magnificent, sprawling, and occasionally drunken architecture, to a series of dots and dashes. It is the starvation of communication. To save time, we have murdered the adjective and strangled the adverb. We have replaced the correspondence of the heart with a rhythmic dit-dit-dash that sounds like a woodpecker with a nervous breakdown. I visited a telegraph office to observe the lightning pounders at work. It was a sterile, quiet place, devoid of the magnificent grease and steam of the pneumatic works. The operators sat in rows, their fingers twitching on brass keys, listening to the clicks of a distant needle. It was a world of shadows and whispers. There was no thump, no whoosh, no sense of a journey being made. A message simply occurred. "Where is the message?" I asked an operator. "In the wire, sir," he said without looking up. "But I don't see anything moving." That's the beauty of it. It moves at the speed of thought. If it moves at the speed of your thought, I told him, it's likely taking a nap somewhere near New Jersey. But the world, in its infinite thirst for the invisible, fell for the trick. The businessmen realized that while they couldn't ship a grand piano by wire, they could ship a lie about a grand piano much faster than they could ship the piano itself. And in the world of commerce, the lie is often more valuable than the instrument. The arrival of the telegraph was the beginning of the disembodiment of the world. We began to value the signal over the substance. We started to believe that as long as the information arrived, it didn't matter if it had no weight, no scent, and no physical presence. The electricity killers didn't just kill the pneumatic tube, they killed the arrival. In the old days of the post, a message had to arrive. It had to be delivered by a human being or spat out by a machine. It occupied space. It had a presence. But the telegram didn't arrive. It just appeared, like a bad omen or a sudden draft. It lacked the dignity of the canister. I watched as the great iron pipes of the city began to feel the chill of neglect. The hurricane was still blowing, but it was no longer the only wind in town. The vacuum pumps were still thumping, but they sounded increasingly like a heart that was losing interest in its work. The lightning tamers were stringing their webs across the sky, and for every mile of wire they hung, a mile of iron pipe seemed to sink a little deeper into the mud of irrelevance. It was a skeptical dismay that I felt, the dismay of a man who sees the world becoming thin. We were trading our iron artery for a copper nerve. We were moving from a world where we moved things to a world where we merely moved news about things. I asked an old tube operator, a man who had spent 40 years in the service of the suction, what he thought of the new electric rivals. He spat into a bucket of coal and looked at the humming wires above the street with a look of profound loathing. "It's cheating, Mr. Twain," he said. "It's a trick. They ain't moving nothing. They're just pretending to be everywhere at once. You give me a canister and a good head of steam, and I'll give you a message you can weigh on a scale. You give them a wire, and all you get is a twitch and a bill for the service. It's the end of the physical man. It is." He was right in a way. The electricity killers were the first wave of a modern army that has been trying to evict us from our own bodies ever since. They taught us that speed is everything and that the physical world is just a slow-moving obstacle to be bypassed by a spark. We have won the battle of speed, no doubt. We can now talk to the moon in a heartbeat. But sometimes, when the world feels particularly ghostly and thin, I find myself longing for the thump. I miss the sound of the brass soul arriving in its iron cage. I miss the smell of the hot iron and the stale wind. For in the age of the electricity killers, we have gained the lightning, but I fear we have lost the thunder. And without the thunder, how is a man supposed to know that anything of importance has actually happened? Chapter 18. The 1984 Sunset in Paris. There is a popular and rather gloomy book written by a gentleman who I suspect spent far too much time sitting in the rain without an umbrella, which suggests that the year 1984 was destined to be a time of universal misery, where a giant, unblinking eye would watch your every move and a cold, mechanical heart would dictate your every thought. It was a vision of a world turned into a gray digital prison. But, as is often the case with prophets of doom, the author neglected to account for the stubborn, glorious, and entirely illogical nature of the French. While the rest of the world in 1984 was busy inventing the personal computer, a device designed to allow a man to make mistakes at a speed that would have baffled a lightning bolt, and while the invisible signals of the satellite were whispering through the ether, the city of Paris was still possessed of a subterranean digestive system that would have been perfectly familiar to a man from the days of the Second Empire. I find a profound and holy satisfaction in the fact that for nearly a century after the rest of the world had surrendered its soul to the wire and the wave, the Frenchman remained true to the thump. I visited Paris during that final sunset year of the new. It was a city caught between two civilizations. Above the streets, there were glowing screens and neon lights, and people wearing clothes that looked as though they had been designed by a colorblind tailor on a dare. But beneath the streets, the great vacuum was still drawing its breath. The iron pipes were still warm. The canisters were still flying. It was a mechanical anachronism of the first order. It was as if you were to walk into a modern laboratory full of gleaming glass and humming electricity, only to find a medieval alchemist in the corner trying to turn a lead pipe into a gold sovereign with the help of a very tired bellows. I spoke to a Parisian operator, a man who had survived 2 world wars, 4 republics, and at least 6 changes in the price of a decent Bordeaux. He was the last of his kind, a guardian of the gust. He sat in a station that smelled of ozone, old paper, and a century of trapped wind. "Monsieur Twain," he said with a shrug that seemed to encompass the entire history of human folly, "the world has gone mad for the silicon. They want the message to be a ghost. They want it to be a spark. But a Frenchman, he knows that a message without weight is a message without soul. When I send a petit bleu, I feel the air move. I hear the pipe speak. I know that my thought has traveled through the mud and the stone to find its destination. Can a computer give you the thump of a delivered secret? It cannot." He had a point. There is something fundamentally dishonest about a digital message. It arrives without effort. It leaves no trace. It is here one moment and gone the next, like a politician's promise. But the pneumatic post was an honest labor. It required the moving of the atmosphere. It required the straining of a pump. It was a physical commitment to the act of communication. The French kept their system running until 1984, long after the telegram had been buried and the telephone had become a common nuisance. They kept it because they understood that the art of the pressurized secret was a part of the Parisian character. For 100 years, the city had breathed through those pipes. Every scandal, every invitation to a duel, every request for a mistress's forgiveness had been sucked through that iron honeycomb. To turn off the pumps was to stop the very lungs of the city from breathing. But even a Frenchman must eventually face the horror of progress. The end came in March of 1984. It was a quiet catastrophe. There were no riots in the streets. There were no speeches in the Chamber of Deputies. There was only a final, lingering sigh of air as the pumps were shut down for the last time. I was told that the final canister was sent with the solemnity of a royal funeral. It was a brass cylinder, polished until it shone like a new sun. Inside was a single slip of blue paper. It didn't contain a stock tip or a declaration of war. It didn't even contain a grocery list. It contained a simple, elegant, and perfectly French farewell. The wind has ceased. The secret is out. Adieu. Pop his thump. The last breath of the Victorian world was exhaled into the dark. And then the silence. It was a silence that marked the end of the physical age. We had finally successfully evicted the thing from our communication. We had replaced the brass canister with the bit and the byte. Units of information that have no weight, no scent, and no ability to strike a man on the shin. We had moved into the era of ghostly whispers. I stood on a bridge over the Seine that evening and looked at the city. The lights were twinkling, the computers were humming, and the satellites were busy raining their invisible nonsense down upon the rooftops. The world felt very fast, very clean, and very empty. I thought of the miles of iron pipe now resting in the mud, cold and silent. I thought of the canisters that would never fly again, and the vacuum that would never again pull a secret through the dark. We had gained the instantaneous, but I couldn't help but feel that we had lost the actual. The 1984 sunset in Paris was not the end of a mail system. It was the end of a way of being. It was the moment we decided that we no longer needed to move the world to speak to it. We had discovered that it was much easier to stay perfectly still and let the ghosts do the talking for us. It is a more convenient world, no doubt. I can now send a message to a man in Japan in the time it takes me to find my spectacles. But sometimes, when the glowing screen is flickering in my face and the invisible signals are buzzing in my ears, I find myself longing for the sound of a steam engine. I miss the smell of the hot grease and the rhythmic, subterranean thumping of the city's heart. For while a ghost can move faster than a man, a ghost can never give you the satisfaction of a satisfying arrival. And as any Frenchman will tell you, a secret that hasn't traveled through a subterranean hurricane is a secret that isn't worth telling. The sun has set on the iron artery, and we are left to navigate the dark with nothing but our sparks and our whispers. And I, for one, would trade 1,000 silicon chips for one good, solid thump of a brass canister hitting the basket at 30 miles an hour. Chapter 19. The Luxury of the Slower World. I have often observed that the human race is the only collection of creatures on God's green earth that will spend 100 years trying to get somewhere faster, only to spend the next 100 years complaining about how much better things were when we were moving at a trot. We are a people who have successfully murdered the interval, and now that the corpse is cold, we find ourselves missing the very thing we worked so hard to kill. I am speaking of the luxury of the slower world. In the days of the Pneumatic Post, as I have spent some time explaining, there was a physical thump that accompanied the arrival of a thought. When that brass canister hit the basket, it was a sound of completion. It was a reward. It was a mechanical exclamation point that told the recipient, something has happened, a journey has been made, the air has been conquered for your sake. There was a certain ceremony to it. You heard the whistle of the approaching wind, you felt the faint vibration in the floorboards, and then thwack, the arrival. It was a moment that demanded you stop what you were doing and acknowledge the world outside your own head. It was a tangible, heavy, and satisfying proof that you were still part of the great conversation. But we have traded the thump for the ping. We have replaced the brass soul with the invisible signal, and in doing so, we have discovered the unrewarding arrival of the modern age. I have watched the men of the 20th century with their little glowing boxes and their silent whispers. A message arrives, and what happens? Nothing. A tiny light flickers, or perhaps the man's pocket gives a faint, ghostly shiver, like the ghost of a mosquito, trying to remember how to bite. There is no noise. There is no heat. There is no sense of a subterranean hurricane. It is a most unrewarding way to be told that your aunt is coming for dinner or that the bank has decided to keep your house. We have made communication so easy that we have stripped it of its value. When a message is a physical thing, a piece of paper inside a metal pill that has been screamed through the earth, it has a certain weight. You respect it. You treat it with the gravity it deserves. But when a message is just a flicker of light that costs nothing and requires no effort, it becomes as cheap and as disposable as a politician's handshake. I once knew a man in Virginia who refused to use the telegraph because he claimed it robbed him of his anticipation. "Mark," he told me, "half the fun of getting a letter is the 2 days you spend wondering what's in it. You imagine it's a fortune from an uncle or a love note from a widow, or at the very least, a decent recipe for peach brandy. By the time the postman arrives, you've lived a dozen different lives. But with that electric wire, the news hits you before you've even had a chance to hope for something better. It's a rude way to be treated." He was a wise man, though he did eventually go broke waiting for a check that never came. He died with his anticipation entirely intact, which is more than most of us can say. We have lost the luxury of the pause. We have forgotten that the slower world was a world that gave a man time to find his better nature. If you had to wait an hour for a pneumatic canister to arrive, you had an hour to realize that you didn't really need to be angry. You had an hour to remember that the man you were writing to was, after all, a fellow sufferer in this vale of tears. But today, we are connected in a way that feels suspiciously like being shackled together in a dark room. We are constantly being prodded by invisible signals. We are never alone with our own thoughts, because the ghostly whispers are always there, demanding our attention, interrupting our naps, and ensuring that we never have a moment of peace. We have replaced the arrival with the intrusion. I find myself longing for the days when a message had to work for its living. I miss the sound of the steam engines and the smell of the hot grease. I miss the sight of a boy with a lever and a soot-stained face, who knew that he was the master of the wind. I miss the physicality of the world. We think we are faster and smarter and better because we have eliminated the vacuum pump and the iron pipe. We think we have reached the pinnacle of progress because we can send our nonsense around the world in a heartbeat. But I suspect that we are merely more efficiently bored. We are receiving more information and feeling less of it than any generation in history. The pneumatic canister was the last great symbol of a world that still believed in the solid. It was a world where a thought had to have a body and a journey had to have a destination. It was a world that understood that a thump is a much more satisfying thing than a flicker. As I look at the silent, unrewarding arrival of the modern age, I cannot help but feel a sense of loss. We have gained the speed of the lightning, but we have lost the luxury of the slow. We have conquered the distance, but we have lost the joy of the journey. And I fear that in our frantic desire to be everywhere at once, we have ended up being nowhere in particular, waiting in the dark for a signal that has no weight, no soul, and no ability to tell us why we were in such a hurry to receive it in the first place. It is a quiet, empty kind of world we built, and sometimes, in the middle of the night, I would give every invisible signal in the atmosphere for just one good, solid Victorian thump against the floorboards, a sign that the world is still there, still physical, and still capable of moving a piece of paper through the mud just to say hello. Chapter 20. The Moral of the Empty Pipe. We have spent this long subterranean afternoon traveling through the iron guts of the city, listening to the wheeze of the steam engines and the frantic whistle of the brass canisters. We have seen the glory of the vacuum, the dignity of the stoker, and the unholy speed of the whispered rumor. And now, as we emerge back into the light of the present day, a day where the air is thick with invisible signals and the ground is no longer a flute, but merely a place to put a parking garage, it is time to consider the moral of the empty pipe. If you were to dig a hole in the middle of Broadway today and find one of those old 4-inch iron veins, you would find that it contains exactly two things: a great deal of very old dust and a profound echoing silence. It is an empty pipe, a monument to a dream that was once so loud it rattled the windows of the treasury. And therein lies the first moral. Man's greatest invention is always the thing he is currently in the process of replacing. We are a race of creatures possessed by a restless dissatisfaction. We are never content with the miracle we have. We are only interested in the miracle we haven't quite finished building yet. We spent 40 years and $40 million perfecting the pneumatic tube, boring the tunnels, casting the iron, training the tobies, and mastering the pressure, only to drop the whole business like a hot potato the moment we discovered we could achieve a similar result with a copper wire and a spark of lightning. We are like a boy who spends 3 weeks building a magnificent kite, only to leave it tangling in a tree because someone showed him a picture of a balloon. The history of progress is not a story of arrival. It is a story of abandonment. We do not move forward because we have found a better way to live. We move forward because we have grown bored with the way we were living 10 minutes ago. The pneumatic tube was a triumph of the human spirit, a masterpiece of Victorian engineering, and the absolute pinnacle of communication. Right up until the second it became an inconvenience. The vanity of the straw. There is a certain vanity in the pipe that I find particularly touching. We truly believed that if we could just build the tube long enough and the pump strong enough, we could outrun time itself. We thought we could inhale the future. But the empty pipe tells us a different story. It tells us that no matter how fast you move a letter, you cannot move the human heart any faster than it has been moving since the days of Adam. A man can receive a message in 10 seconds through a tube or in 1/1000th of a second through a silicon chip, but it still takes him 3 weeks to decide if he's going to pay his taxes or tell his wife the truth about the missing cigar money. We have accelerated the delivery, but we have done nothing to accelerate the wisdom. We have honeycombed the earth with our ambition, and all we have left to show for it is a collection of hollow iron. It is a sobering thought. It suggests that our grand achievements are merely the discarded toys of a species that doesn't know what it wants, but wants it delivered at 30 miles an hour. The theology of the next best thing. The moral of the empty pipe is that man's true invention is not the machine, but the itch. We are born with an itch for the next best thing. We have a thirst for convenience that is more powerful than the suction of a coreless engine. We will trade the solid for the spectral, the thump for the flicker, and the dignity of the canister for the anonymity of the signal, all for the sake of saving 5 minutes. 5 minutes that we will then spend staring at a wall or wondering why we feel so lonely in a world that is so perfectly connected. I look at the empty pipes beneath our feet, and I see a reflection of our own heads. We are forever hollowing ourselves out to make room for the next hurricane. We are constantly boring new holes in our lives, hoping that the next invention, the next invisible whisper, will finally be the one that delivers the secret of happiness. But it never is. The secret is always in the next canister, in the next pipe, in the next century. The final thump. And so we reach the end of our narrative. The pumps have stopped, the steam has cleared, and the western tornado has blown its last breath. The pneumatic era is over, buried beneath the asphalt and the indifference of a world that has moved on to ghosts and sparks. But as I close this book and prepare to return to the quiet shadows of the great library, I cannot help but feel a lingering affection for the iron artery. For all its noise, for all its grease, and for all its magnificent absurdity, it was a human thing. It was a machine that you could understand. It was a hurricane you could hold in a bottle. It reminded us that communication is a struggle. It reminded us that to speak to one another, we must move the world. It gave us the luxury of the arrival and the dignity of the physical. The modern world is faster, cleaner, and much more convenient. But as you sit there with your invisible signals and your silent pings, remember the empty pipe. Remember that your greatest invention is already becoming obsolete as you use it. And remember that beneath your feet, in the dark and the mud, there is a mile of cast iron that still remembers the thump. It is the sound of a world that was once solid. It is the sound of a time when we still believed that if we could just blow hard enough, we could make the truth travel as fast as a lie. We were wrong, of course. We were magnificently, gloriously, and Victorianly wrong. But oh, what a fine noise we made while we were trying. And with that, I shall unscrew the cap, pull out the final message, and signal the operator to shut down the pressure. The journey is over. The hurricane has passed. And if you'll excuse me, I believe I hear a horse and carriage at the door, and I've a sudden, desperate craving to travel at a speed where I can actually see the two-headed calf before it disappears into the fog of progress. sound of a heavy brass lid screwing shut, a final distant echoing thump, the end.